Hi folks, Juju here. Big shout out to Caden Gardner, the genius behind the Cadenverse. If you like this story, go check out this other video by Caden, which is also a story that takes place in the Cadenverse. Link will be in the description.
What's the worst thing you've ever done? Was it horrible? Unspeakable? Straight up evil, maybe? Was it bad enough for you to end up in hell for all of eternity? I ponder those questions as I sit here typing away on this keyboard with an uncertain future. I did terrible things with my life, sure, but I never really considered myself evil. I didn't remember how I died. All I remember is waking up in a haze. My senses were groggy, my throat was dry, and my eyes hurt. It was dark, almost pitch black wherever I was. The air was hot and sticky. It reeked of rotten and burning meat. I tried to cry out, but my throat had trouble producing the words. Like I said, my throat was dry. I tried to move, but my muscles screamed as I lifted my arms. That was when I realized I'd been chained to the floor. I pulled a little harder. The chains were heavy, but I still managed to move. They made this god-awful screech as they drug across the hard floor. I groaned as I pulled them. The last thing I was expecting was the voice. Mr. David Stone. The voice called out. It seemingly came from all directions at once. Where? Where you are is not important. Now, listen to my instructions very carefully. I won't repeat myself. All you need to know is that you exist now as a battery, and I am the one assigned to make sure you stay charged. What? I asked. A sudden shock of electricity came flooding through me. My muscles tensed as I screamed in agony. Don't interrupt me. The voice sneered. The voice wasn't particularly deep or intimidating. It did seem hollow and void of any kind of emotion. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a male or female. Now, in order for you to stay charged, there are various things I must make you feel. None of them you will find pleasurable. You will cry. You will feel pain like you've never felt while you were alive on Earth. You will beg me for death. But in the end, your calls for mercy will fall on deaf ears. There is no mercy down here, only suffering. Take consolation in the knowledge that your sacrifice, be it deserved or not, will serve to benefit Gehenna and all of its denizens. In the end, your suffering is the most honorable thing your kind will ever accomplish in its entire miserable existence. I sat there silently, my muscles still aching from the electric current that had just torn through me. My eyes still trying to scan the darkness. What was Gehenna? Was I here to be tortured? My mind was having trouble trying to comprehend. I'm sure you have several questions, Mr. Stone. Unfortunately, I run a tight ship and have little time on my hands, so I'll allow you one. My mind was still far from being stable. I had so many questions, but I just couldn't bring any to my lips. I strained for a second before I got to my feet. Who are you? I asked with a hoarse voice that was almost a whisper. My name is Saxon. You will address me as master. That was when the lights came on. I found myself sitting in a glass box that seemed to float a few feet from the ground. The chains wrapped around me were blacker than black. They were crude in their design. I wondered how they managed to get electric currents through it. But I only wondered for a split second, as my eyes shut up to the being standing before me. It looked like a man, but it was far from human. Its body was human. It was pale, almost paper white. Its head looked like that of an angry lizard. Its features were reptilian. From the slits where its nose should be to the inky black eyes, I could make out a row of sharp, serrated-looking teeth behind its thin lips. The creature showed no expression towards me. It just glared into my very soul. I froze in fear as we locked eyes. Welcome to Gehenna, Mr. Stone. Or, as you humans say, welcome to hell. The next few hours were a blur as I regained my senses. The chains had fallen off. My glass box had been moved into a giant row of glass boxes. Each of them had their own occupant. Most were men from what I could tell. Everyone sat in a corner, kind of just staring out into space. I think that was when it actually dawned on me that everyone, including myself, was completely naked. Naked and mostly hairless. I remember running my hand across my now bald head as I turned around. My muscles ached with every movement. It grows back, then they shave it. Makes us easier to torture. A voice said from the cell next to me. What? I asked as my eyes met his. The man in the cell next to mine was a tall, broad, and hairless black guy who had a wide smile across his face. Your hair, for your denizen body, he said as he pointed to his head. My denizen what? I asked. Your denizen body, at least, that's what the hellspawn around here call it. It's the body they assign your soul to when it comes down. I was a bit confused, and my face showed it. He only chuckled a bit. You must be really new here. Tell me, do your muscles hurt, like when you move? He asked. I nodded. That's because you've never used them before. Your body was grown in the flesh pits on the second level. When you died, your soul was sent straight here, and then assigned a function. I guess you drew the short straw, 'cause you get to be a battery. A battery for what? I asked. The man put his hands up. All of this place feeds off of negative energy. I was still confused as hell, but my brain started to register. I raised a brow at him as I stepped closer to the wall. So, I'm dead? And this is hell? The man nodded. Do you remember your name yet? He asked. I thought hard about it. I wasn't sure about my name. I didn't even know who I was. The creature called me David, I said. Well, David, my name's Dwayne. Like The Rock? I asked. Rock? He asked with a confused look. My brain went fuzzy for a second. I'd actually remembered something. He's an actor. Big dude. Used to be a wrestler. Dwayne shook his head from side to side. I'm going to be completely honest with you, David. I was killed in 1972. How? I asked. How'd you die? He replied. I sighed as I tried to remember. He only took a deep breath. It'll come back to you. My thought process, however, was interrupted by a buzzer that rang so loud it made my ears hurt. My hands shot to my ears as I dropped to my knees. My ears were ringing and I could feel blood beginning to gush out. Then, just as fast as it started, it stopped. What was that? I asked as my eyes tilted over to Dwayne. Torture time, the man said as he got back to his feet. Torture time? I asked. 23 hours a day. Used to be longer, but the hellspawn all went on strike. Seriously? I asked. Dwayne smirked at me. No, rumor has it. Dwayne's speech was interrupted by a sudden spike that shot up from the floor of his cube. It was thin and translucent like the glass that made up the cube itself. It went through the bottom of his foot and through his armpit before exiting the shoulder. Dwayne groaned in pain as his hand shot out and grabbed it. A crimson pool had already started below him. Oh God, I said as I tried to keep myself from vomiting. My luck, however, wasn't any better as a spike came horizontally in my cell. I tried to dodge. I thought maybe I could duck out of the way, but it was a stupid and foolish idea. The spike hit me in the right side of my chest before exploding through my back. Blood splattered all over the back of my cell. I screamed in agony as another spike flew through my back and exploded out of my stomach. I could feel the hot tears and blood flowing down my face. The pain was indescribable. I looked over at Dwayne, who winced as another spike came flying through his back and out his front. The last thing I remember was looking at one of the glass walls. It seemed to vibrate at a certain point, almost like a disturbance in water from a specific angle, before a spike came flying directly at my face. When I woke up, I found myself floating in a pool of warm sticky fluid. I was still in my glass box though. I groaned as my body went vertical. My feet touched the ground, and my eyes shot directly ahead of myself, where Saxon stood with a disappointed look on his face. "Mr. Stone, you're not supposed to pass out during your draining sessions. You only lasted 20 seconds. Each session lasts 23 hours. I could feel myself about to say something, but then I remembered the last time I spoken out of line. "I know you're new down here. It takes time to adjust." I felt the area on my forehead where the spike had impaled my face. I could hear Saxon exhale at this. "You're not dead, because your body was grown to regenerate. You can come back from any wound. It helps one last a bit longer during our sessions. The only thing that could really kill your body is one of these," he said as he held up an obsidian black short sword. "A weapon from our armory." I didn't say anything in response. I just watched the weapon as he moved it around, my mind immediately wondering how I could take it from him and bust out of here. Only problem was, he seemed to notice. My thought process was interrupted by a sudden and abrupt shock that made my muscles clamp up. I roared in pain as I fell underneath the translucent liquid. I had my mouth open. The stuff burned like acid as it went down my throat and into my lungs. It took me a second to come up for air and cough the substance up. I could see Saxon smile at me as he stepped closer to the glass. His sharp and serrated teeth were yellow and blood-stained. "Insubordination will not be tolerated, Mr. Stone." By now, I could feel the anger rising in my gut. I wanted to get out and kill this thing, but I didn't know how. I could only glare at him through the glass as he turned and walked away. The liquid in my box slowly started to drain. I found myself covered in it. My cell moved itself back into the line of other cells, where I saw Dwayne trying his best to reattach one of his arms. I inhaled as I watched the veins and muscles seemingly stitch themselves together. It looked disgusting. It also looked painful. Dwayne winced hard as the muscles and sinus reconnected. "Don't worry about him. No one stays conscious the whole day," he said with a grunt. "What?" "Those that do are taken to another level. Most of them are fucking sadists anyway." "Where are they taken?" I asked. Dwayne shrugged. "Never been out of this box. You're lucky you came on the spike day. Yesterday, we were eaten by hellhounds." My eyes got big as I exhaled. This was the new forever for me. I sat down and leaned my back against the wall. The sticky substance that had slathered up my body acted as an adhesive. I felt like my back was coated in syrup, and I'd laid down against something. I didn't really care though. My mind thought on Saxon's sword. That was when another image flashed through my mind. I remembered being on a rooftop. I was surrounded by men in black uniforms that all had assault rifles aimed at me. I had my pistols raised at them as well. It was cold outside, quite possibly the middle of winter. To my right stood a priest. I couldn't tell you his name if I tried, but he was on my side. I had thought we were about to die. I was ready to die right there. But someone saved us. It was a man in a black metallic suit of armor. One who wielded a short sword that was glowing a neon blue color. The man cut through the soldiers like they were made of paper. He saved us. My mind reeled from the memory. I took a deep breath as I looked across my cell at Dwayne, who sat there watching me. Then, I looked at the cell behind me. It was empty. I remembered there being a person in there when I first been brought in. I turned back to Dwayne with a perplexed look on my face. "He's today's special battery," Dwayne said with a sad look in his eye. "What's that mean?" I asked. "Saxon's special batteries get to power the appetites of the master himself. Appetites? As if on cue, the man was dragged back in by two more larger men, both of which were wearing thick black collars that seemed to be made of the same metal that had created my shackles from earlier. The glass on the cell slid open, and the man was sloppily tossed in. I watched the two burly men as they walked away. They actually wore baggy burlap-looking pants. My eyes met one of the two's. The man seemed to immediately look away, almost like he was afraid. Those are Saxon's personal slaves. Every once in a while, a soul comes through that he takes a liking to. Sounds a hell of a lot better than this, I said. Believe me, they're not better off than we are. My eyes shifted to the man in another cell. He was a chubbier man that was also completely hairless like we were. He was curled up in a ball in the center of his cell. I could hear him sobbing. My eyes shifted back to Dwayne. What did you mean by appetites? I asked. Dwayne took a deep, shaky breath. It depends on how Saxon is feeling that day. Sometimes he's hungry. Sometimes he's horny. Sometimes he wants to do the torturing himself. I grunted and mumbled under my breath. You were thinking about taking a sword. He can sense defiance, you know. That one behind you. He was a lawyer in Maryland before he was killed by some drug dealer. I think he abused his wife, came down here and immediately started making demands, threatened to sue several times. He was defiant until he became the favorite battery. He's been the favorite battery since he came here. When was that? I asked. 10, maybe 15 years ago. No one's even thought twice about crossing Saxon since. Not that we could if we tried. I sighed as I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. I can see the defiance in your eyes, David. Do yourself a favor. Don't buy into it. It was too little too late, however. I'd already made up my mind. I was gonna find a way to kill this Saxon. I didn't care if it took me 100 or 1,000 years. I could do it. I would do it. The next 2 days' torture was exactly as one would expect in hell. They were awful. The first day, I received a slow acid bath that took most of my skin within the first 12 minutes. I passed out around 30 minutes in. The next day was worse. They turned on some kind of heat lamp that brought a whole new meaning to the term, burn in hell. I stayed awake a lot longer during that one, even with my feet blistering and my skin cooking and melting until it was black and charred like a fucking burnt hot dog. I managed to stay awake for 7 hours. It was when I woke up from being cooked that I found myself face to face with Mr. Saxon. He was wearing a pressed suit. He looked at his watch and then me. Mr. Stone, you're showing improvement fast. I'm impressed. I groaned as I sloshed around in the translucent slime. I looked at my hand as the sticky substance had gotten between my fingers. I wondered what this stuff was. It was as if Saxon could read my mind. It's from the flesh pits. It's the substance that in which the bodies are grown in. It helps grievous wounds heal faster, so we can get you back to your suffering. I looked him up and down, noticing the suit. He seemingly read my mind again. The King of Gehenna is having a party tonight. A banquet in honor of the success of his newest earthly project. Something someone close to you played a huge hand in seeing to fruition. You know, Operation Lazarus. I watched him with a shocked look in my eyes. He only smiled at me. Of course, your memories aren't all intact yet. I do, however, have orders to bring your cell up to the King's Banquet Hall for well, you're gonna be the guest of honor. I stood in awe-stricken silence for a moment. I was a guest of honor for a banquet? In hell? For a moment, I thought Saxon was playing a prank on me. So now what? I was to go and party with Lucifer? Saxon took a deep breath. Before we go, there are some rules that I would have you follow. Number 1, don't speak unless spoken to. Number 2, if you see someone who triggers a flashback, don't let it turn into a violent rage episode. If you embarrass me in front of the king or any of the 9 princes, I'll increase your suffering 20-fold. You understand me? Yes, I said. Yes, what? Saxon sneered. I took a deep, long breath. Yes, master, I replied. Saxon smiled at me. Very good. Hell's banquet hall was a hell of a lot scarier than I'd imagined. Saxon had snapped his clawed fingers, and we'd suddenly found ourselves at the front gate to a large obsidian wall. It was hundreds of feet high. My eyes drifted upwards to the blood-red sky that poured a red tint over everything. It was made from a crude black metal and ornate with a simple carving of a horned dragon. My eyes scanned the top of the walls, where I saw what looked like humanoid silhouettes. They were draped in crimson and held spears and shields. But that was all I could make out. In my mind, I pondered whether or not they were souls assigned a function or actual demons. Saxon walked up to the door and knocked twice. It's Saxon, Master of the Damned on level 5. The doors opened slowly, and Saxon turned to look at me. He smiled widely as he spread his arms out wide. Welcome to the city of these. His slaves pushed my glass cell through the front gates of the city. The first thing that caught my eye were the buildings. They were all massive and made from the same obsidian metal as the walls. Most were formed in jagged and unnatural shapes. The streets were paved out of the same stone. The more I looked around, the more I realized that the city itself had been cut from a singular rock. All the buildings were connected to the ground, but there was no seam line between them. This place wasn't built, it was carved. There were no citizens on the street. For such a giant city, the place was practically empty. All was quiet, aside from the grunts of Saxon's slaves behind me. I was taken to the main palace in the center of the city. It was a massive black pyramid that's pointed miles up in the sky. It was by far the largest structure I'd ever seen. I started to sit down in my cell when Saxon turned to me with a glare and told me to get back to my feet. I was pushed into a triangular-shaped opening in the side of the pyramid. On the outside, looked to lead into a dark void. I was hesitant about going in, but it wasn't like I had a choice. I was pushed through, and immediately after passing the darkened threshold, I found myself in a large room. My cell was flanked on either side by more slaves. But these ones weren't like Saxons. I mean, they wore the same collars, but these ones were all naked and disheveled females, all of which looked like they just come out of some kind of orgy. Saxon examined them with a look of disgust. The harlots of Asmodeus, they know little suffering, he muttered as he waved the slaves, pushing myself forward. I was taken into a large ballroom where the creatures of the night awaited me. There was a long black table in the center. None of the creatures were seated though. They were all congregated around the room. The creatures came in all shapes and sizes. Some of them looked to me like humanoid creatures with various demon-like features. Some had horns and goat feet. Others had the top half of a human conjoined with the bottom half of a serpent. Some had multiple arms. Some had the features of a lizard, similar to Saxon himself. I wanted to curse under my breath, but I knew that it would be a bad idea. A woman with 4 arms, whose bottom half was that of a serpent, slithered straight up to Saxon, before straightening her body up in front of him. If not for her savage mutations or demon features, she could have been beautiful. Her hair was silver and long, her lips red, and her eyes seemed to glow green. Princess Azazel, Saxon greeted with a slight bow. Master Saxon, what is this snack you've brought into our banquet hall? She asked as she eyed me. This is the king's special guest, David Stone. Azazel eyed me up and down as she slithered her dark red snake-like body around my cell. He looks delicious. Can I try him? she asked. Saxon laughed. That would be up to the king. Oh, Saxon, just a tiny bite? She asked as her snake-like features suddenly started to disappear. Her tail seemed to melt as her extra arms seemed to fold into her. She was shape-shifting into a more human-like appearance. Princess Azazel, you're not to eat my slave, Saxon said with a bit more of a boom in his voice. Azazel ignored him, however, as she looked at my crotch with a smile. She adjusted her black dress as she turned to him. Can I at least fuck him? She asked. Saxon raised a brow as he turned to look at me. I had an already shocked look on my face. I could feel this body's new heart pounding away in my chest. Not right now, Saxon said. Shame, she said as she turned and waved at me before walking back towards the table. Saxon turned and looked at me with a smile. Don't get any ideas. She'd eat you the moment she finished, like a fucking black widow. Of course, I'm sure if this goes well, she'd probably buy you. I'd look past him at another glass box that was being wheeled inside across the room. This one held another man who was on the heavier side. He wasn't fat, but he wasn't muscular either. His whole body was shaven like mine. His most discernible feature was his large nose. His eyes caught mine. There was a hint of realization in them. His face contorted as I watched him mouth my name. You recognize him? Asked Saxon. No, master, I replied. This may help. He was your old boss. Images flashed through my mind. The next thing I knew, I was sitting at a desk fresh out of the United States Army. A man sat across from me with a thick head of black hair that had been gelled backward. A stone-cold look in his eyes, and that exact same nose. So, what makes you think you have what it takes to join the CIA? He asked. Shaw, I said to myself. Yes, he's been staying on level 6 with Master Ross, said Saxon, as he motioned the slaves to pull me forward. Saxon met Ross at one end of the room. Ross looked almost exactly like him, just instead of being white, he was a weird gray color. They seemed to carefully avoid the others as they met. Shaw stared at me from his cell as we were lined up next to each other. I tried not to look at him, not to speak to him. I knew we'd both be punished if I did. I watched the demons in the room all suddenly start taking more human-like appearances. That was when I started counting. There were 9 male and 7 female demons, not including Saxon and Ross. They all started methodically taking their seats. That was when another glass box was pushed into the room, this one containing another man who looked Hispanic to me. But unlike any of the other prisoners I'd seen, he had a feathery snake tattooed across his back. He was also the only one I'd seen with long graying black messy hair and a thick beard. Who's that? Asked Saxon. Hector Morales. He would have been inducted into our free-reign denizen class for his efforts on Earth, but he tried to fight Victor the moment they locked eyes, Ross said quietly. Hector's cell was pushed right next to ours. He didn't look at either of us. He just buried his face into the back corner of his box. I turned back to look at Shaw. The man was still staring at me intently. I took a deep breath as I let my mind wander. My thought process was suddenly cut off by a loud, deep horn. My eyes were drawn to the big iron doors that sat just beyond the head of the table. A demon stood there with a large red horn in his hand. The doors were opening slowly behind him. It was almost ominous. The room was eerily silent aside from the slow footsteps coming our direction. My eyes glanced down towards Saxon, who was kneeling. I looked back up at the doorway, where a familiar-looking man in a suit stepped out with a happy expression across his face. He was kind of far away from me, but I could still make out his facial features. He had jet black hair that was gelled straight backwards. His goatee was thin. He had a strong jawline as well as a decently built frame. His eyes met mine as he calmly took his place at the head of the table. My king, Lord Abaddon, savior of Gehenna, how gracious of you to bless us with your presence. One of the demon's voices called out. I wasn't sure which face it came from. I was focused on the king. Shut up, Azuzu, the king said with a sly smile as he looked upon his subjects. His gaze fell upon Azazel. It seems things have been running smoothly in my absence. I'm almost impressed. Almost? Asked Azazel. Yes. Well, energy output from the 6th and 8th levels are down roughly 3%. I mean, it's not a big deal, especially since the other 7 levels are all up. Especially level 7, he said with a smile. A 16% increase in output within the last 2 years. I do believe that's a new record. That isn't a fair assessment. We're getting an influx of wrathful souls on that level. Lots of violent people have been dying lately, said another demon. This one, a bald man in a suit. The king's eyes shot over to the prince. Prince Baal, tell me, what kind of suffering are you imposing on those damn souls on level 6? Same as everyone else. We have the torture boxes. The same torture boxes as everyone else, but a decrease in production? Why is that? Abaddon asked with a tilted head. Baal started. Because you're not pushing your masters hard enough to get the job done. They're unmotivated, lazy. We aren't getting the same soul influx. You don't need the same soul influx. There are billions on your level. Make them suffer, or I'll get someone who can. Baal exhaled as he leaned back in his chair. Yes, my lord. Abaddon leaned back as his eyes scanned the room. He smiled at me, then his eyes went back to his subjects again. Anyway, I didn't come all the way back to Gehenna to talk business. I came here to celebrate, and celebrate we shall, he said as he clapped his hands. Several slaves that's been dressed like waiters at a fancy restaurant came out with platters of what looked to me like steaming severed arms and legs. One even put a plate in the center of the table that contained a roasted human head with an apple in his mouth. I wanted to hurl at the mere sight of this, but I couldn't hurl up anything if I tried, because my body didn't eat anything. I sure do love the flash pits, Azazel said as she poked at the severed arm on her plate. Tell me, what was this slave's name? Asked another demon. Please, I don't get their names. They're only numbers to me. I'm not like Asmodeus, Azazel replied with a laugh. Abaddon raised a brow at this. A slave walked up behind him and whispered something in his ear. He stood at the end of the table. Finally, the flash pits have finished casting bodies for our newest associates. I want to introduce you guys to the newest general of our armies, he said as he raised a wine glass full of human blood. A figure marched out of the tunnel behind him. It looked like an older-looking man with white hair that was combed to one side. He wore a crude black chest plate with black robes underneath. On his back sat 2 rat bat-like wings that were folded into place. He had a sword on his hip and a stern look in his eye. Newest general? Asked Azazel. He is to be my right hand. He will answer only to me. He will be my vessel while I am away. And who is this man? Asked Baal. This is now the fallen angel that made our plans on Earth Prime work. This is Victor. All of the demons stared at him for a second. I watched the newly appointed general, my mind already ripe with a new memory. This one of a cell phone with Victor's image on it. I'd been doing research for days on Gideon Pharmaceuticals. I was sitting in what I think was a safe house. I was on the run from them. They'd sent mercenaries after me. I just couldn't remember why. At least, not until Abaddon cut my thought process off. And this is another who worked for me. He was one of the first to try our version of the horseman's Omega Serum, he said as a Hispanic man in an all-white suit walked out from behind him and stood next to Victor, his hands crossed at his waist. This is Davis. He will be the newest game master on level 7. Do you understand, Azazel? Azazel stood up and examined the man closely. Abaddon watched her with a smirk. Azazel nodded as she circled him. She sniffed the air and then walked back towards her seat. He will do. Anyone's better than my last game master anyway. Perfect, Abaddon said as he clapped once. Then, last, but certainly not least, we have the Ripper himself, Jackson de Campo. He'll make a fine addition to our forces down here, Abaddon said as his eyes glanced up at me. That was when I saw him. The man that made everything come flooding back. Flashes of Anna, the woman who bore my child, her body lifeless and cold in my arms, her emerald eyes void and empty, her life taken by the very man that stood at the end of the table. I could feel my body tremble with rage. The flashes continued. I could remember it all the destruction that I caused in the Shadow Wars, leaving the CIA to be with Anna, my daughter. Father Raphael and I had been protecting her, a young woman who hadn't even made it out of her teens yet, a woman who was the key to uniting our species, a young woman that I gave my life to protect. Jackson had killed me, or I had killed myself trying to take his life. I could see his eyes move up and meet mine again. He smiled widely, as did Abaddon. Had I not known some semblance of self-preservation, I'd have tried to break the box to go after him, to choke whatever afterlife he had out of him. I don't remember anything else that was said by Abaddon. My eyes were locked solely on the smiling vampire that stood before me. Abaddon and his subjects went on talking. Jackson walked up to me with a smug look in his eyes. He stood at the edge of my glass box. Saxon stood behind him with a somewhat worried expression on his face. "Hello, David," Jackson said through a wicked smile. His teeth had somehow looked even sharper than they had before. I looked at Saxon, who only nodded calmly at me. "What do you want?" I asked. "Nothing. I'm dead." "It's strange, isn't it?" he asked. I didn't respond, which only made him chuckle a bit. He leaned on my torture box. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Stone. How on earth did you end up here? I mean, other than the complete genocide of my species. I thought you fought for the good guys." I again didn't answer. I only glared at him. My thoughts were ever consumed with ways to make this being suffer. Jackson smiled as he turned back to Saxon. "You must have done a number on him. The man I knew on Earth would have tried to kill me at least twice by now." "He suffers like the rest of my flock," Saxon answered. Jackson turned back to me and smiled even wider. "You see your wife yet? She must be down here somewhere." My eyes widened with rage as I started to take a step forward. "Mr. Stone," Saxon growled. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hands clenched into tight fists. "That is enough for now. If you want to gloat, come to our level after the banquet," Saxon said as he eyed Jackson. Jackson smirked at Saxon and then grinned at me. I exhaled as I looked up and past Jackson. Abaddon sat there watching me with an intrigued look in his eyes, one that honestly sent a shudder down my spine. I quickly glanced back down at Jackson, who was starting to walk away. That was when Abaddon stood up and raised his wine glass. "A toast to David's daughter. Without her sacrifice or her blood, none of what we're trying to do would even be possible." All of the demons whooped and cheered. But it was all drowned out to me by the sudden agonizing realization that something had happened to her. Something had happened to my little girl. Something that I'd paid the ultimate price to prevent. I could feel tears welling up as my legs turned into jelly. I dropped to my knees, my eyes staring ahead but focusing on nothing. "Oh look, his torture box is charging," Ra said as he nudged Saxon. I could see Saxon rub his chin with intrigue. Well, would you look at that? All this did, however, was get Abaddon's attention. "Oh, David, Abaddon said as he approached my cell. "You should be honored. Her suffering benefited the greater good. In time, all of humanity will be made better. They will become the very things that they were meant to be, and it's all thanks to your daughter. They'll all serve their purpose for a better and more prosperous Gehenna." I could feel the sorrow in my gut turning into rage. It burned like the fires of the very plane of existence that I stood on. I gritted my teeth as I got to my feet. "David?" I could hear Saxon growl. "I think the slave has something to say." "Well then, let's hear it," Abaddon said with a calm look in his eye. "I'm going to get out of this box. I don't care if it takes me 100 days or 100 years. But when I do, I'm gonna fucking kill every one of you ungodly abominations. Starting with you," I said as I looked at Jackson. The vampire smiled sheepishly at me, which I can remember finding odd in the moment. Abaddon turned to Jackson, and then he looked around the room. The whole place erupted in hysterical laughter. He smirked as he turned to me. "You have drive. I respect that. You humans, some of you at least, have balls that none here could muster within 1,000 years. I like you. You have what we call potential. I may even make you a member of our military one day. But first, unfortunately, you must learn that insubordination will not be tolerated." He turned to Saxon and nodded. The next thing I knew, I was being electrocuted. Pulses of an electric current tore through every muscle in my body. I stood there as long as I could, glaring at Abaddon. He smirked as Saxon upped the voltage. The next thing I knew, I had fallen to my knees. But I didn't cry out. I didn't beg. I only stared at the King of Hell, the rage I felt towards him keeping me conscious. That was until the spike went through my skull. "You should have listened to me," Saxon's voice said softly as I came to. I was back in my cell slot, back on level 5. I groaned as I started to move around, only to find very quickly that my arms and legs were tied up and stretched in differing directions. My body suspended a few feet above the ground of my cage. I grunted as I fought against the chains holding me in place. "You embarrassed me in front of the king. Now you gotta pay. Now you're my new favorite prisoner, and you're gonna learn respect." An electric current ripped into me through my wrists and ankles. I winced as my muscles tightened. He stepped closer to the glass. "Making threats against the king? I don't know who you think you are," he growled as another current ripped through me. I wasn't gonna give him the satisfaction of watching me scream though. All I could think about was getting out of here so I could get my hands around his throat. I think he read my mind, because the next thing I knew, the wires holding me suddenly dropped me to the floor. "Okay, David, if you think you're violent enough to escape, let's see. Bring in the dogs." I could hear them before I could see them. The snipping of jaws, the growling and barking. The slaves were struggling to hold back the Hellhounds. It took 4 slaves to hold one dog. The dogs were huge, at least the size of horses. They looked like black wolves with red, glowing eyes and matted blood in their fur. The side of my cell opened. Saxon took a step backward as the 2 hounds filled the entrance, both salivating and drooling as they looked at their next meal, which just so happened to be me. I gritted my teeth as I stood ready for the onslaught. The slaves struggled to hold the hounds back as they bit and snapped at me. "Now, Mr. Stone, please try not to scream," Saxon barked as he nodded to the slaves. The dogs came at me fast and hard. I put my hands up to block the incoming jaws of one. The teeth practically snapped my arm as they clamped down. I shoved my thumb into its eyeball. The creature whimpered as it fumbled backward, but that was when the other one jumped on top of me. I think I managed to get a few shots in, but the last thing I remembered was being covered in cuts and blood as jaws clamped down on my face. I woke up a few hours later in brutal, agonizing pain. Everything that could hurt did hurt. It took me a full minute to get my bearings as I looked down. My intestines were being yanked out by a hungry wolf. It tugged and tugged. As it did, more searing pain ripped through me. I discovered both my arms had been torn off, and one of my legs was hanging on by a piece of meat. My remaining eye looked past the wolf at Saxon, who was staring at me with a serious glint in his eye. I honestly wanted to scream, but I couldn't. There was a hole where my throat used to be. "Pull them back," Saxon said sharply. The slaves yanked the wolves backward until they were out of the cell. One even took the rest of my intestines with it. Saxon calmly stepped into my now blood-splattered cell. "This is just the first day," he said as he squatted down in front of me. "I see that physical pain doesn't cause you as much suffering as it should. That's fine. I want you to know, however, that we found your ex-wife. She's on level 2. I'm gonna have her brought up here in the morning. Then, I'm going to make you watch what I do with her." I could feel my heart flutter as my insides boiled with rage. I started to struggle, but it was all for naught. Saxon only grinned as he stood up, and then walked away. A little while later, I found myself in the healing solution from the flesh pits. My wounds were grievous from the Hellhounds. Dwayne stood watching me from his cell with his arms crossed. A look of pity was plastered across his face. "I warned you about becoming the favorite." "I know," I replied. I'd say I was listening to what he said, but my mind was on one thing. They were bringing my wife up soon for some kind of sick game. A game that they expected me to play. I remembered that the slaves would come get me. I'd already made the plan in my mind. I was getting out of here. The liquid from the flash pits slowly started draining from my cell. As I stood there, I stared at my now healed flesh inside. I could already hear the footsteps of the men coming down to get me. There were 2 slaves, both with spears tipped with the black metal. I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. They were scared I was gonna try something. They were right. They marched up to my cell, the glass let down slowly as they watched me. They didn't make very many facial expressions. They both had black-bladed knives on their belts. I made sure to make a mental note of it. "Step down," one of them said sternly. I did as I was told. That was the first time I'd been out of the box since I'd gotten here. The air was colder than I'd imagined. It was brisk. I looked the guard who had given me an order in the eye. "Can I have some pants?" I asked. "Shut up," he barked as he shoved me along. They led me between the rows of torture boxes. They seemed to stretch on for miles and miles. I was ahead of the 2 guards. Their spears were trained on my back. I sighed as I started walking. The stone floor seemed a bit cold to the touch. I couldn't help but glance around at all the poor men and women that'd been stuck down here. We walked for what seemed like 5 minutes before the floor ahead of me suddenly opened up into a ramp, almost like it had a secret compartment. Saxon stood at the base with his hands in his pockets. Jackson stood next to him with a wicked smile. "Hello, David," Jackson sneered. I growled under my breath before one of the slaves pushed me along. I was taken down into the tunnel below just as the torture alarm went off. I could hear the screams as I was led into what looked like a high-class businessman office, complete with a wooden desk which Saxon took a seat at. Jackson stood next to him. His hungry eyes were upon me as the slaves forced me to sit down at the other side. I felt as if I was being forced into an interview. My eyes scanned the room. I caught a glimpse of a massive obsidian door that was directly behind Saxon's desk. Saxon looked at me as he leaned back. He exhaled. "So, as it turns out, your soul isn't supposed to be here," Saxon said with an annoyed voice. I looked at him with a raised brow. I didn't really care at the moment. I wanted to know what was going to happen with my wife. "Abaddon brought you down here himself. He stole your soul before it could be sent to heaven. As with several new arrivals over the last few months, he's been busy. Not that I mind torturing souls meant for heaven." My heart would have dropped at the statement if I hadn't been thinking of something else. I didn't reply. I just sat there with a glare in my eye. "Nothing?" Saxon asked. "Where's Anna?" I demanded. "She's busy. They're prepping her now. It takes time and resources to move something from Asmodeus's level, especially since he spends all his time either or forcing his souls into orgies." "What?" I asked. Saxon smiled at me. "Did you think she wouldn't be touched down here? She was sent here while her family was an enemy of the Queen Mother. She's not exactly what you remember." I could feel my heart pace quicken. I think Saxon could hear it, because he only leaned in closer. "Tell me, what would you have done if you'd made it to heaven, then found out she was down here? Would you beg, plead for the almighty angels to come down here and get her? Or would you bask in your eternal peace?" I just about shut up from my chair, but as I did, Jackson was suddenly in my face, a sharp knife to my throat. Saxon only rolled his eyes. "You're still under the impression that your situation has some semblance of hope. You're not going to heaven. In fact, you're not going anywhere. You belong to me," he growled as he motioned for his men. Jackson backed off of me. "Bend him over the desk. I'm going to end this insubordination." I could hear Jackson cackle as the two slaves went to grab my arms. They made a mistake though. They had underestimated how fast I could move. The first guy reached for me. He was big and slow. I grabbed him by the wrist with one hand and twisted his whole arm behind him while taking his knife. I put the knife to his neck as I started backing away back towards the doorway. Saxon had some kind of bewildered look on his face while Jackson only laughed. "Mr. Stone, do you really think?" I cut him off by shoving the knife deep into my hostage's neck. A fountain of crimson spewed everywhere as I turned and threw the knife at the next slave. The point planted itself in the man's stomach. I knew I didn't have more than a few seconds before both Jackson and Saxon would be on top of me. I turned and grabbed one of the slaves' spears from the corner of the room and turned with the point aimed out. Jackson had already been charging me as I'd predicted. My spear found his gut. He only looked at me with surprise as I yanked it out. His blood and guts spilled all over the floor. My eyes then found Saxon, who hadn't stepped away from his desk yet. He only stared at me with confusion. I wasn't about to take the chance. I turned and ran towards the door, grabbing the other slave's spear on the way out. I ran hard and fast, eventually making it back to the rows of torture boxes. I sprinted down the lane I'd entered. I could hear the other prisoners being tortured. It looked like today was more of the spikes. I could hear their screams combined with the shouting of more guards. At that point, I wasn't sure what I'd gotten myself into, but it was too late to stop now. I ran until I found my cell. My eyes looked over at Dwayne, who had managed to avoid several of the spikes and was staring at me with a confused look on his eye. "Stand back!" I shouted as I took one of the spears and launched it into the glass opening on his cell. The spikes immediately retracted as the glass fell to the floor. Dwayne stepped out of the box for the first time in over 60 years. "How did you?" he started. "No time. Take this," I said as I handed him the other spear. And that was when I could hear several more guards running our way. I turned to face them. There were 4 men, all with the same collar and pants combination that the other slaves wore. These ones, however, didn't have spears as they all had short swords. I didn't hesitate. "I've got the 2 on the right," I shouted as I charged in. The first slave to me had his sword raised high as he let out a shrill battle cry. I ended that with a simple spear point to the face. The next slave slashed at me with his sword. I managed to sidestep the blow as I ripped my spear out of the first guard's face before shoving it through the second guard's chest. I turned to Dwayne, who's managed to kill both his assailants as well. "How do we open these torture boxes?" I asked. He looked at me and shrugged. I rolled my eyes. "We need to leave," he shouted. "They're in no position to fight right now." "You were," I said as I ran up to one of the torture boxes. This one containing the short chubby man that had been the previous favorite slave, and hit it hard with the black tip of my spear. It shattered, but the man inside had already been turned into a pincushion and passed out. I growled under my breath before Dwayne grabbed me. "If you want people to be able-bodied, free them during the empty hour," he said as he pulled me along. I hated it, but he was right. They'd be able to move then. I was lucky to have freed Dwayne when I did. We stole the guards' pants and swords. Then the two of us took off in the opposite direction of the one we came from, sprinting as fast as we could down the lane. People screaming on both sides of us. That was when I'd noticed that my body wasn't getting tired or exhausted. I mean, my muscles had hurt before, but never from exertion. We'd full-on sprinted for what felt like 30 minutes before we came to a stop. "Do these things go on forever?" I asked as I looked up. It was only then that I realized I'd never looked up at the ceiling of this place. The torture boxes stretched high up into the sky, if you could even call it that. The place did have a ceiling. It was black and looked like it was made from the same material as the weapons we carried. "Mr. Stone, I see you've gained an accomplice," Saxon's voice called out from behind us. I turned to it. Saxon stood, flanked on both sides by slaves, all of which were armed with swords and spears. "I'm impressed, Mr. Stone. No one has ever attempted an escape and made it this far before. Not on this level, but I'm afraid this is where it must end." I didn't reply. I only glared at him, which made him smile. "Your suffering is going to be legend." I cut him off by launching my spear at him. The spear must have taken him by surprise, because it hit him dead center of the chest before exploding out of his back. He stood there for a second, almost like he was having a hard time comprehending what had happened. He dropped to his knees, then fell face first onto the floor. The 30 or so slaves who'd been with him all looked at me, and then his body. The slave nearest to the body dropped down next to it and started rummaging through Saxon's pockets, until she found something. She yanked a key out and used it to unlock her collar, before tossing it to another slave. She ran straight up to us and knelt down in front of me. "Thank you, Lord Maxis." Whoa, wait, I'm nobody's lord," I replied. She looked up at us with a confused expression. "You're not? But you freed us." "I'm not. Who is Lord Maxis?" I asked as I turned to Dwayne. "He's a legend among these parts. The last survivor of the 9th Legion, after they were all but destroyed at the Battle of the River Styx. The rumor was that Maxis survived and has been growing a rebellion of souls down here. It's obviously just a myth, but people cling to whatever hope they can find, especially in hell." I exhaled as I looked at her. She had been completely shaven as well. Other than that, she looked like a reasonably athletic woman. "How do we stop the torture boxes?" I asked. "That's a bad idea. If we do that, it'll draw the attention of the other sectors on this level," replied another slave as he approached. This one a broad Asian man. "Why?" I asked. "If there's no energy output, they're gonna wonder why." "How long do we have before they notice something is wrong?" I asked. The man shrugged. "That depends on how long it takes Saxon to grow another body. Then I'm sure we'll get the guard dogs." "Hellhounds?" I asked. "No, those are being kept in the stables. I'm Terry, by the way," he said as he reached out his hand for me to shake. I did so and turned to the girl. "What about you?" I asked. "I'm Alice." "Well, Terry, Alice, how do we get out of this godforsaken place?" I asked. The two looked at each other. You can't escape this dimension. Not to Earth Prime. Not with the monolith being closed," said Terry. "You seem to have a lot of information," I said. "I'm Saxon's bookkeeper. Or I was, before you murdered him. That was a bad idea, by the way. He's gonna come back, and he's gonna be pissed." Dwayne grumbled something under his breath. "You said the monolith to Earth. Are there others down here?" I asked. "Yes, there is one that leads to Purgatory, but you have to have a key for it. We don't know where that is, though." "Fuck," David groaned. "There is another option," said Alice. "It wouldn't work. It's on the 9th level, at the very bottom of the 9th level. You'd need an army to get down there," Terry replied. "What is it?" I asked. "We don't know. There have been rumors, stories really, that there is a way to call heaven, created for innocent souls to try and escape. But we'd never make it there." I chuckled. "Well, according to Saxon, I'm not even supposed to be down here. So, it's worth a shot. But I have to get something first." "Get what?" asked Dwayne. "My wife." Terry and Alice led us to the slave armory next. It was bigger than I'd expected. There was enough weapons to arm around 1,000 of us. I guess Saxon had a larger police force than he wanted us to realize. Our numbers swelled as Alice recalled the slaves. We had, by Dwayne's account, around 600 heads in our little revolt. Not nearly enough. I stood at the base of the armory as Terry, Alice, and I tried to make up our minds. "We don't have enough people or weapons to try to hold this place. If we try to run, they'll ride us down," Terry said. "We'd increase our numbers if we freed everyone from the boxes," I replied. "We couldn't arm them. Their vessels would only be killed and their souls sent to the flesh pits for repurposed bodies," said Terry. "So, how do we get them out?" I asked. "We can't. Not yet. If you want more people, I'd recommend going to level 7. All they do is fight in Azazul's games," Terry said. "First things first, we need to escape this level. How can we do that?" I asked. Terry thought for a second. "Saxon's office. There's a door that leads to this level's backrooms." "Great. Hell has backrooms," Dwayne mumbled. Terry nodded. "The demons use them to get from sector to sector on this level. There might even be a way to the next level in there." "So, it's not guaranteed?" asked Dwayne. "Well, it's not like there's much more they can do to us. I mean, we're already in hell," Alice said. I looked around at the group. Everyone seemed poised and ready to go. "Then, let's go," I said. It was a weird feeling passing Jackson's body. I'd done my best to kill him on Earth. It had even cost me my life. I stood in the center of Saxon's office while Terry and Alice tried to get the obsidian door opened. That was when I noticed all of the symbols carved into it, all of which looked almost like runes. "What's the hold-up?" Dwayne said impatiently as he looked around. The recruits we'd just gained had set up just outside the office rampway. It was as if they were creating a perimeter. "I'm just trying to remember what order I'm supposed to." Terry touched several of the runes. The door suddenly shifted. Then it opened. "Got it," he said. The back rooms of hell were strange. The first thing I noticed when I entered was the smell. It was like rancid and rotting meat. In appearance, it was like a long industrial hallway. There were massive black pipes above us. I stepped into the back hallway with a tight grip on my spear. Terry was next, then Dwayne, then Alice, then the rest. The hallway was long. It seemed to go on forever. The ceiling was maybe 50 feet high. There were more black obsidian doorways every 60 feet or so. Passing each one had my new body's heart racing. "Where do you think each one goes?" I asked. "Not sure. I've never been through any of them," Terry said. That was when the door ahead of us opened. Out walked a dark-headed woman in a scarlet dress. She was followed by several slaves that were all naked, other than the chain around their necks. The woman came to an abrupt stop when she saw us. Her eyes were large, and she made an audible gasp. I very quickly charged forward with my spear raised. Her guards formed a shield wall around her. "Stop!" she commanded. I'm not sure why I stopped. It may have been the line of shields and spears aimed at me. My rebels stopped behind me. "Where is your master?" the woman demanded. "Left a spear in his gut. Who are you?" The woman's expression morphed to one of fear. You killed your master?" she stammered. I didn't have time to deal with this. We had to keep moving. "You didn't answer my question." The woman seemed to take a second to regain her composure. "I am Cleopatra, master of the 27th sector of the second level. You killed him!" shouted Alice from next to me. The rebels charged past me into the shield wall. The first few that landed were skewered. Blood went all over the stone floor. I stood in shock. My forces outnumbered Cleopatra's by the hundreds. It didn't take long for her guards to be brought down. Time seemed to blur. Call it the fog of war if you wish. The next thing I knew, Alice was dragging Cleopatra and throwing her at my feet. I squatted down in front of her. "You're Cleopatra? The Cleopatra from Egypt?" The woman's nose had been bloodied in the scuffle. She looked at me with a glare in her eyes. "You think you're doing something by rebelling? Let me just tell you what happens to rebels down here. Cleopatra was interrupted by a sudden kick to the face from Terry. It was only then that it occurred to me just how brutal these people were. Who could blame them though? They were in hell. Cleopatra wiped her nose before spitting some blood on the stone at my feet. "How do we get to the 9th circle?" The woman in the scarlet dress laughed loudly. "Why the fuck would you want to go to the 9th level? Do you know what's down there?" "A way out," Terry growled. "Only if you get past the beast." "Beast?" I asked. "The creature that used to guard Lucifer's cage before he escaped." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. "If he escaped, then it wasn't much of a beast, was it?" I asked. The woman considered this for a minute. "You'll never make it down there. You'd need an army." I looked at those standing behind me, then back at her. "An actual army," she corrected. I thought of my wife before turning to Dwayne, who nodded. Terry looked at me. "Level 7, that's where we should go," he said. I nodded, then turned back to the woman. "Level 2 was supposed to bring Saxon a package today. Where is it?" "You mean the woman?" she asked. "Yes. Asmodeus was actually just sending me down to inform him that she's been taken by King Abaddon." My chest fluttered a bit. "Why?" Cleopatra shrugged. "No one knows why the king does what he does." I turned back to Dwayne. I remembered the capital. If that's where Abaddon had Anna, that's where we, or more accurately, I would have to go in order to save her. The place was a fortress. I didn't have the men nor the weapons. I looked at the crowd around us. They were all watching me expectantly. "Tell me how to get to level 7, I growled as I turned to Cleopatra. "Or what? You'll stab me? Kill me? Torture me? Please, I've been down here so long I've..." She was again interrupted by Terry's foot. She held her face for a second as she regained her composure. "You're going to show us," I said as I motioned for the two nearest me to get her to her feet. "Or what?" she barked. "How long has it been since you've been inside a torture box?" Dwayne asked. "She's Asmodeus' little whore. She's probably never been in one," Alice growled. I could see Cleopatra's eyes narrow for a split second. She was horrified, but she hid it well. "Well then, let's show her," I said. The crowd started to converge on her. She broke almost immediately. "Wait," she pleaded. Everyone stopped for a split second. "Most teleport around, but for those who can't, there's a series of doorways. Each level has a set that leads to 8 of the 9 levels." "8?" I asked. "The only doorway to the 9th level is in the capital, and it's guarded by the beast," she said. "Where's the doorway to level 7? I asked. "In Prince Satanus' chamber with all the others," she barked. I could hear the others groan behind me. "Who's Prince Satanus?" I asked. "The one the masters of level 5 answer to," said Alice. I looked around at the group. Everyone looked horrified. "That may not be a battle we can win, especially against the prince," Dwayne said. "We don't have to win. We just have to get through the door," I replied. Cleopatra laughed. "You're all fucked." Terry raised his fist. "Wait," I said. Terry stopped. "I have an idea," I said. About an hour later, 22 of us were pretending to be Cleopatra's guards. The plan was that a few of us would use Cleopatra as cover to sneak past the prince, while the rest of us hid out until we came back with an army of souls from level 7. From there, we tried to fight our way to the capital and through the door to the 9th level. It was a long shot, a feat almost impossible to accomplish, but we knew that we had to try. Cleopatra begrudgingly led us to the doorway where Satanus' chambers lay. Satanus sat on a throne of his own. His chambers were massive, but not quite as massive as the banquet hall. The walls were the same black rock as all the buildings in this place. Satanus sat on a black throne. He was a beast of a demon, with blood-red reptilian skin around a humanoid figure. He had 2 black wings coming from his back and a set of horns that resembled that of a goat. He smiled as Cleopatra walked in, showing off a set of massive jagged teeth. "Back already?" His deep voice boomed. "I was only sent to deliver a message," Cleopatra said. "The message is delivered." She led us to the doorway. Satanus' inky black eyes watched us the whole way. I won't lie, my heart was beating 1.5 million miles a minute. This prince was easily 15 feet tall, taller than any I had seen at the banquet. "Does Asmodeus have business on the 7th level?" he asked. Cleopatra turned to him and smiled nervously. "In fact, he does. You know him. He's a sucker for the games." "He's a sucker for a lot of matters of the flesh. Violence isn't one of them," Satanus said as he stood up. "It's not the violence he admires, so much as the show itself." Satanus raised a brow. I could tell he wasn't buying it at all. The grip I had on my spear tightened. He started to speak when the doorway to level 2 opened. Out stepped a very angry Saxon with a fresh new body. "My prince, sound the alarm!" We didn't waste any more time. Cleopatra activated the doorway and we marched through. We entered Azazel's throne room, which was almost a mirror of the one we were just in. Only it was empty. We forced Cleopatra to guide us. It took some time, but we found ourselves exiting a massive black palace. This was my first time outside in Gehenna. The first time not in the box, at least. It was cold, colder than anywhere I'd ever been, but there was no ice or snow. The sky still had a red haze to it. The area we'd exited led us into a small city. This wasn't These, but it looked very similar. "What is this place?" I asked. "Just the capital of the 7th level," Cleopatra hissed. "It's too quiet out here. Where are the free-range souls? The demons?" muttered Terry. "Where are the slaves? The games?" demanded Alice from behind me. "Where else could there be gladiatorial death matches?" asked Cleopatra as she looked ahead of us. It was hard to spot at first, or maybe I just didn't notice. Ahead of us was a massive Colosseum, one that was eerily similar to the one in Rome. But, like everything else in this place, was made from that godforsaken black metal. That was when I could hear the cheering. It was faint. "So, everyone is in attendance," I grumbled. Cleopatra turned back to me, her eyes annoyed. "So, you see the arena. How are you going to free the warriors?" I honestly didn't have a clue, but we had managed to figure things out so far, or so we thought. "Let's get to the—" "Stop!" a booming voice interjected from behind us. We all turned quickly to find Satanus standing there with both Saxon and Azazel right next to him.
They were flanked by actual demonic soldiers, each with pale white skin and standing at least 8 to 10 feet tall, their mouths lined with razor-sharp teeth. They wore crude black armor and wielded long sharpened pikes. "Oh shit," I heard Dwayne say. I eyed Azazel, who only smiled widely at me. I could hear Cleopatra laughing behind me. My heart jumped into my throat. I honestly didn't know what to do. There was. Until... "Mr. Stone," Mr. Saxon's voice barked. "You're becoming quite the pain in my ass." We found ourselves surrounded, pikes pointed at us on all sides. "Tell me, David, what exactly was your plan?" Saxon demanded as he approached me. I wasn't about to go down without at least putting up a fight. Saxon stopped. Azazel turned to Satanus. "I'm not going back. None of us are going back." Saxon scoffed. "You don't have a choice in the matter. As I said, you exist as a battery, and it's my..." "Saxon," Satanus interrupted. Saxon turned back to Satanus. "Azazel has made me a generous offer for your special battery and his friends." "But," Saxon asked in a confused voice. "Oh, Saxon, don't look so down. This group is going to be a smash hit in the pit," Azazel said as she slithered past him and began to approach me. "The Helion Rebellion itself," she turned back to Satanus and Saxon, "has got a good ring to it." Satanus nodded. Saxon looked almost appalled. "But sir, he insulted us. He needs to be punished," Saxon pleaded. Satanus smirked. "It's also an order," Satanus growled. I still had my spear up. I looked at Dwayne. We didn't have an out, not a good one at least. "What do we do?" asked Terry. I gripped my spear tighter. "We're not going out without a fight," I said. Azazel, hearing this, smiled sadistically as she turned to me. "You'll get plenty of fight where you're going," she said as she snapped her fingers. The next thing I knew, I was standing in what looked like an office. I had my spear up. Carlos Esteves sat at a wooden desk with a massive smile on his face. "David," he said excitedly. "I was wondering when you're going to stop by." I kept my spear trained on him. "What just happened?" I demanded. Azazel said something about an ambush before she left. Says she was going to send you here and oh yes. He raised one of his hands. Suddenly, an invisible force yanked the spear from my hand. The weapon flew straight into his. He chuckled. "That never gets old. Now please, sit." I stood there a bit awestruck. He motioned his hand again, and an invisible force pushed me down onto a wooden chair opposite the desk. "That's much better." "What are you gonna do to me?" I demanded. "What am I going to do to you? Nothing," he said. I narrowed my eyes at him. "Azazel has developed an interest in you and your little cohort. She thinks you can be the next main event. Let me just say, I couldn't agree more." "Main event?" "In the Gahenian Games, the biggest gladiatorial pit in the multiverse. Observe," he said as he snapped his fingers. I suddenly found myself sitting in a suite of some kind, overlooking a massive gladiatorial arena. My eyes widened. The arena was massive. The best thing I could compare it to was a football stadium, except the field was black and surrounded on all sides by glass walls. That was when I realized. The arena was a massive torture box. 2 men stood in the center. One, a frail-looking bearded man in brown robes. The other, a gunslinger of some sort. I looked around at the crowd. All were those tall white-skinned demons I'd seen mere moments earlier. All were cheering. Ah, what an interesting matchup. Rasputin versus Jesse James. "Now, watch closely," Carlo said. The 2 men watched each other closely. They were far away, so it was hard to make out their facial expressions. I assumed they were about to fight. The gunslinger pulled his guns with almost supernatural speed and fired away. The bullet, however, never reached the roped man. As he lifted his hand, and a massive wall of orange flame rose up from the black dirt beneath where the gunslinger was standing. The man was burned to a crisp in a matter of seconds. Well, that was anticlimactic, Estevez said to himself as he leaned back in the seat next to mine. I told you James wouldn't be a match for him. Azazel's voice sounded off from behind us. I didn't dare turn to look at her. Her mere presence sent a chill up my spine. If Rasputin was a shot at the champion, he needs to earn it, Estevez said. He's been trying for nearly 100 years, beaten countless enemies, Caesar, Genghis Khan, Spartacus, but he hasn't had a matchup that's wowed me yet. Not like David over here, Azazel practically whispered into my ear as her hands found their way onto my shoulders. I was frozen solid. I didn't know what to do. Have you told him yet? She asked as she turned to Carlos. About who he and his little rebellion will be fighting. I turned and eyed Estevez. Have you ever heard of Marcus Licinius Crassus? Asked Carlos. The guy who beat Spartacus? Azazel looked at Carlos with an amused expression. Someone knows his history, she said. We figured he and a few Roman legionnaires would be a perfect matchup for you and your friends. I narrowed my eyes. And what happens if we win? Nothing. You get to fight in the next match, and then the next, until I get bored and sell you off to someone else, Azazel said. She spun me around to face her, then sat in my lap. Even though she was in a more human form, she still weighed a ton. Think of it like this. The more suffering you force onto your opponents, the less you have to suffer yourselves. Any questions? Where's my wife? I demanded in a stern voice. Azazel smiled at me as she ran her fingers down my face. I could feel myself shudder at her touch. Look at you making demands. So cute. She moved her mouth to my ear. But you don't have to worry about her anymore. She's with the king now, and he will do as he wishes with her. That statement flooded my body with rage, but there wasn't anything I could do about it. Not yet. I knew they were all playing some sick game with me. I wasn't sure why or what for, but the thought only sharpened my resolve. I would get out of here. I would escape. And if I couldn't, I would burn this whole fucking place to the ground. A few hours later, I was brought to a staging area where Dwayne and Terry were picking out weapons for our fight. Dwayne looked up right as Azazel's guards shoved me inside. David? He asked as he approached. They didn't take you guys back? I asked. Dwayne shook his head. Azazel brought us all, Terry said. It's better than the torture boxes, Alice said as she pulled a spear from the wall. I wouldn't be so sure, I replied. Our group was still only around 20-ish people. I wasn't sure what to expect in the battle we were going to be facing, but I knew that if we were facing off with a Roman general, we'd lose a straight-up fight. I looked around at the weapons. The walls were filled with all sorts of swords, shields, spears, and axes. However, none of them were made from the black metal, which meant none of them would kill our captors. I could also see other warriors picking their own swords. What are you thinking? Asked Dwayne. We came down here to get warriors, right? I asked. We did? We should start trying to make friends. That was when I heard a wheezy laugh from my left. I turned to see a bearded man standing between two aisles of weapons. I can remember being taken a bit by surprise at this. None of us had any hair, but everyone on this level did. But then again, the torture down here was combat. They didn't need to shave their bodies every day. Friends? The man asked. You can't make friends in hell. And why's that? I asked. Do you know why we're down here? People with friends don't make it down here, he said.
I can think of maybe 10 of the most evil men in history that had friends. I pointed out. Haha, were they friends? Or yes men? He replied, waving his finger. Who are you? I asked. The man smirked. You can call me Gabe. And what are you down here for? I killed a bunch of people. Like, murdered them? Asked Alex from behind me. Well, yes and no. Anyway, that's not important. What is important is that you people understand. Everyone who's down here is down here for a reason. We earned our fates. Gabe said before turning and walking away. Dwayne and I stood there in silence. I can't lie. Hell already had a way of sucking the hope out of your soul. Gabe's words certainly didn't help. Our first fight was about an hour after that. The 20 of us walked out onto the black sands with our swords and spears. I had grabbed a short sword and a circular shield. The crowd bellowed in applause when we walked out. The noise was louder than any football game I'd ever been to. Then came Estevis.
You heard the rumors? And the rumors are true. A rebellion grew in the very depths of level 5. It was small, but dangerous nonetheless. They even killed one master and kidnapped another. But like all rebellions, they were defeated, sentenced to be tortured by their level's demon prince.
The crowd grew louder. Carlos's voice grew more powerful.
But our princess Azazel made a deal. A deal she made for your viewing pleasure. I give you the Helion Rebellion.
The crowd cheered so loud, it shook the stadium. I turned to Dwayne. It was clear that communication would be hard in this arena.
And on the other side,
Estevis started. I turned my head to the other side of the arena, where the doors on the wall opened.
Ancient Rome, one of the Earth's first superpowers. One of the most effective militaries in history.
The grip on my sword tightened as the men marched out in formation. There were maybe 30 of them, all clad in Roman armor, their spears and shields ready for us. Out in front of them was a single man, one who I knew, but only by name from the history books.
This man was the bane of Spartacus, one of the first triumvirate, the beast of the Parthian Wars. I give you Marcus Licinius Crassus.
The crowd cheered even harder. I looked up at the suite, where Azazel smirked and waved at me, while Estevis continued.
Now, we all know the rules. We fight until we can't fight anymore, no matter the damage, no matter the pain, no matter the suffering. Rebels, are you ready?
I didn't respond. I only gripped my sword even tighter, my eyes now on the general who gave his orders.
Romans, are you ready?
Estevis bellowed. The Romans all cheered in unison.
Fight!
I stood still with Dwayne. We watched as Crassus divided his men into 2 units. Shit, I said to myself. These men had fought together way more than we had. They were organized. They also outnumbered us by a small margin. I turned to give a command, but before I could, both Alice and Terry, along with half our force, charged forward, screaming like banshees as they did so. They ran straight into Crassus's shield wall and were both brutally cut in two by the spears and swords. Dwayne stood next to me, as did several others. Crassus only smiled at us from under his shield. The crowd bellowed. The Romans were coming at us from 2 directions. What do we do? Dwayne asked. I could barely hear him. My eyes rested on Crassus, who stood behind his lines. The Romans were closer now. There was nowhere to run or hide. There was no real way to win this fight. Unless... I stepped forward and pointed my sword at Crassus. A formal challenge. You and me,
I bellowed. Crassus raised an eyebrow as he turned to look at Azazel. Azazel laughed as she nodded. Crassus motioned for his men to halt.
It looks like Mr. Stone has issued a formal challenge,
Estevis's voice said, ecstatically. Crassus stepped forward with his sword and shield. It wasn't until I got closer that I noticed. His body wasn't like the rest of ours. His eyes had gone inky black and his teeth had been sharpened. The skin that was visible was also a paler complexion. He seemed to notice me looking. He pulled his helmet off, revealing a head full of silver hair, almost 7 feet tall, taller than he was as a human. So did he give you a demonic body, or did your old one slowly morph into that? I asked. Crassus smirked. The king fancies my abilities. He blessed me with this form. I twirled my sword as I got into my combat stance. Well then, it's a shame I'm gonna have to mess it up, I said with false bravado. Crassus came at me hard and fast. His blows were precise, and near impossible for me to keep up with. I blocked maybe 2 blows with my shield, before a searing pain in my leg brought me to my knee. Crassus stood over me with an evil smirk. You have balls, human. I like that, he said, right before shoving his sword into my throat. I awoke a few hours later, naked, and in another glass box. The slime from the flesh pits was all over me. Azazel stood ahead of me with that same smirk on her face. Mr. Stone, I thought you'd last longer, she said. I didn't reply. I only glared at her, which seemed to make her smirk grow. I suppose it's my fault. I should have warned you about your enemies, enhancements. But still, you chose to face Marcus Crassus alone. Tell me, was it to try to protect your new friends? I didn't know what to say to her. I took a deep breath as I slowly got to my feet. I'd like to go and prepare for the next fight, I said softly. Her eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and enjoyment. Oh, really? I nodded. I didn't know what to expect last time. Now I do. Azazel let out a laugh. Oh, I knew I liked you, she said. So, who will it be? Spartacus? Attila the Hun? Hitler? She asked. What? Who do you want to face next? This question caught me off guard. I stammered. You know what? You were a monster hunter in your mortal life. I've got the perfect opponent for you. I was led back to the armory, again. This time, however, my people weren't waiting for me. In fact, the only one in the armory was Gabe, who toyed with a hammer. I went to work looking for a weapon, something with a bit more reach. I groaned as I looked around. I'd seen a man use pistols in a fight earlier. Where were those at? Gabe strolled up next to me. So, how'd it go? He asked. I got a sword to the throat, I replied. Figures. They always give first-timers a mismatch. They do that for your first fight? I asked. Gabe smirked. What are you looking for? A gun would be nice, I said. Gabe nodded. What kind? Depends on who I'm fighting. I could hear Gabe exhale. And she didn't tell you? Just as she had the perfect opponent, I said. Come with me, Gabe said. Gabe led me into a room where several men lounged around in what looked like a pool that was filled with that translucent slime that healed their wounds. One of the men who stood there I recognized. I'd seen him disintegrating Jesse James earlier. The tall bearded man looked at me and smiled widely. Mr. Stone, he greeted as he walked straight up to me. Rasputin? I asked. You're the one who killed the demon master. How did it feel? I can't say, I replied. Rasputin turned to the other man in the bath. He loved it, he said. The men all laughed behind him. I moved my eyes to look over at Gabe. Gabe cleared his throat. Rasputin's eyes narrowed as he looked at him. I could see what looked like a twinge of fear in Rasputin's eyes. How can I help you? "Show Mr. Stone to the modern armory, please." Rasputin gave him a nod. A few moments and a series of always later, I was standing in an armory with just about every firearm I could think of on the wall. "So tell me, what did you do in your, mortal days?" asked Rasputin, as he examined me pulling an M4 off of the wall. I remembered the Shadow Wars, my old CIA unit that used to hunt down and torture and kill vampires. I remember falling in love with Anna, who was a vampire herself. I remember our daughter, the best thing I'd ever created in my life. "I was a lot of things," I said. "A soldier, a husband, a father." My mind wondered what had happened to my daughter. If she had been down here, Abaddon would have thrown it in my face. I knew something bad had happened to her, but I wasn't sure what. While I was thankful she was alive, I was worried that she was suffering. "A soldier, eh? That may help you down here." "What about you?" I asked. Rasputin raised a brow. "I was a priest in most of my lives in the multiverse." "Multiverse?" I asked. Rasputin shrugged. "We all have different lives in the multiverse. You'll remember the rest of yours the longer you're down here, unless you only existed on Earth Prime. Then you'd be what I call interesting." I checked the bullets in the M4 magazine. They were just normal bullets, none of that black metal. I wondered if the weapon would even be effective. "Why so?" "It's very uncommon for a soul to be down here without remembering all of their deaths throughout the multiverse. I remember dying on 200 different Earths, most of which I was rudely assassinated, some in which I summoned a parasite from another dimension that ate my cock. But my Earth Prime death, that came at the hands of a man called Cain." "Cain?" I asked. "The multiverse's first murderer." I pulled a pistol from the wall as well and cocked it before turning to Rasputin. I didn't really care about the multiverse at that moment. I just wanted to figure out my next fight. Who or what was I going to be facing? Where was the rest of my group? I looked Rasputin up and down. He smiled at me. "Azazel is already trying to sell your next fight, which is more than she ever did with me. Don't worry though, I'm not jealous. She wants spectacle. I want to win." She mentioned that you wanted a shot at the champion or something like that. To take a shot at the champion and win would, by Kahinian law, free me from the gladiatorial matches. "Who's the champion?" I asked. "He only fights every 500 years. In his life, he was the greatest general in the army of Nebuchadnezzar. He has no name etched in history. His only mark is the blood he spilled in the name of his mad king." "What do they call them?" "Nurgle," he said. A few hours later, I was being led back to the gladiator pit. I hadn't seen the rest of my guys. I wondered what was happening to them. I'd created a loadout that would fit that of a modern-day soldier, only I'd kept a short sword. I stood at the edge of the black sands. Azazel in her more human form approached me from behind. "Welcome back to the pit, David," she said almost seductively. She made me uncomfortable, and she knew it. Her face was inches from my ear. "Don't be ashamed for losing your first fight. Everyone down here does." I could feel her hands on my shoulders. I gritted my teeth. "Try not to clench up so hard. I won't bite you. Yet." She giggled as she spun me around to face her. "Who am I fighting? You said something of a monster," I asked as I tried to change the subject. This didn't work on her one bit. "Oh, relax, David. We have time," she said as her hand started to run down my chest towards my groin before stopping at the waist. "But if you must know, your opponent is Grendel." The doors to the pit opened behind me. I could hear Carlos's voice call out, "David Stone!" I went to take a step outside. "Oh, a word of advice," Azazel said.
I stopped. You belong to me now. Your wife belongs to Abaddon. There is no changing it. You can't save her. I took a deep breath and walked out onto the black sands of Hell's Gladiatorial arena, the grip on my M4 tighter than ever when I saw what was waiting for me. Grendel was a hulking Goliath of a beast. He had the stature of a gorilla in the upper torso with the legs of a powerlifter. He smiled sadistically as I looked upon his red-tinted skin. His eyes were black as night, and his mouth was lined with razor-sharp teeth. He had no weapons, only his claws and teeth, which I was sure would be used to absolutely carve me to pieces. My eyes shot to Carlos, then to Azazel, who had teleported next to him.
Are you ready?
Carlos boomed to the crowd of demons. His question was met with a wild cheer.
Fight!
He commanded. I didn't waste any time, quickly turning and opening up with my weapon. The bullet passed through Grendel's flesh like a knife through butter. The creature staggered back a few steps. I didn't stop firing or approaching. I managed to push Grendel back into a wall, using his big red hand to shield his face from the onslaught. That was when my gun clicked empty. My eyes grew large as I started to reload. Grendel smiled at this, and I was suddenly backhanded across the arena. I bounced across the coarse black sand, my bones cracking with each impact. I lost my gun in the tumble. I didn't care though. I got to my feet and pulled my sidearm along with my sword. Grendel screamed as he charged me. Flashes of my wife being victim to whatever violations Abaddon was concocting flew through my brain. With a scream of my own, I charged back, firing my pistol into the creature as I did so. The creature was faster than I was. It used its hand to swipe at me, but I somehow managed to slide under it and take a massive chunk from its leg. The creature fell to its knee as its blood spewed out. I got to my feet and spun, leveling the pistol with the back of his head and firing. His head snapped forward. The crowd went silent. I exhaled instinctively as I waited for him to fall. But to my astonishment, he turned to look at me, his remaining black eye full of rage and hatred. I tried to fire my pistol again, but it clicked empty. Grendel got up, letting off a guttural roar as he did so. He threw himself forward at me, both arms outstretched. But he was clumsy. The now missing part of his brain had made it hard for him to maneuver. I scrambled at him with my sword, hacking and slashing in a mad rage, my thoughts on my wife. First went his arm, then his entrails, finally his head. But I didn't stop there. I hacked and hacked until there was nothing left, until my whole body was covered in splattered crimson. I didn't hear the crowd cheer. I stood there, unsure of what had just come over me. I turned to Azazel, who only licked her lips at me. A few moments later, I was led back into the staging area, where I found Dwayne waiting for me with a smile. "You won a fight," he said. "I did," I replied softly, looking around for my other companions. I found most of them there, even Terry and Alice. "Stone?" a gruff voice called out from behind me. I turned to see Crassus standing there with his arms crossed. "The princess wants you to get to the baths. Then, once you're cleaned up, you'll be joining her to watch the next bout." I did exactly that. I got cleaned up and healed. Then Crassus led me to Azazel's suite, where Carlos was busy introducing the next contestants. One was a familiar face, Rasputin himself. The other was one that sent a shiver up my spine. The other was someone I'd seen earlier in the throne room, but I couldn't remember their name. "Who is that?" I asked. "That is Hector Morales, or as you humans call them, Quetzalcoatl."
"Fight!"
Carlos called out. "David, take a seat," Azazel said as she gestured to a chair next to her. I did as asked, watching as Rasputin summoned a wall of flame, while Morales transformed into a massive, feathered serpent. You won your first fight. Tell me, were your thoughts on your wife? Did you feel rage when you fought? Azazel asked with a sly smile on her face. You know they were, I said. Azazel giggled. Rage comes from pain. Pain feeds the dimension and everything made in it. Do you realize how it works yet? She asked. I turned to her and raised a brow. My eyes caught Crassus standing behind her. He had a black sword on his hip, one I knew could actually hurt things down here. My gaze went back to Azazel's green snake-like eyes. She played with her silver hair. No. Azazel leaned closer to me. Your denizen body, it gets stronger when you're wrathful. That's why you beat Grendel. You don't feel it? Come on, David. You really think you'd have escaped without your hatred? All I feel is hatred. I admit it. Good, she said. I watched as Rasputin bathed Morales in flames. The feathered snake roared as it was burned to a crisp. I could only exhale. Still winning battles, I see. Azazel smiled. Should we give him a chance to face him? Asked Carlos. Nurgle? I asked. Carlos and Azazel both looked at me. Azazel smiled widely. I see you've been making friends already, she hissed. I knew you would thrive down here. She turned back to Carlos. Make the arrangements. Then she turned to me. With me, Mr. Stone. She led me down a long black hallway that was lined on both sides with burning torches, my denizen heart racing the whole time. I wasn't sure what she had in store for me, but I knew I wasn't going to like it. We made our way into a bedchamber where a guard shut the door behind us. My eyes scanned the room. The bed was lined with a red silk bedspread, the walls adorned with lit candles. I swallowed hard. I had been first into the room. I could feel her breathing on my neck, her hands running up my sides. David, 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 you're shuddering, she whispered. I'm married, I stammered. Till death do you part, she said as she spun me around to face her. Her eyes looked hungry, insatiably hungry. Her hand ran down my chest and tore my groin. You're mine now, and I worked so hard to get you here. Her expression suddenly changed to one of annoyed frustration. Her hand shot out and grabbed my throat. She lifted me off the ground. You don't realize how lucky you are. You should be on your knees thanking me. My eyes watered as the breath was squeezed out of me. Fuck you, I stammered. Azazel smiled. If only we had time. Put him down, a booming voice said. But I'm not done. Put him down, the voice continued. Azazel dropped me to the floor. I gasped for air as I looked up to my savior. Gabe stood there with his hands on his hips. What's going on? I asked. You really haven't figured it out? Azazel asked. Why would he? Gabe asked as he offered me a hand. I took it and he pulled me up. Gabe? Short for Gabriel? The Archangel? I asked. In the flesh, he said. I had a flash of anger suddenly hit me. I wanted to lay into him. I wanted to pummel him into the ground. Heaven let my wife be placed down here. They let my soul be stolen. They should have stepped in a long time ago. You're angry. Good, Gabriel said sternly. Good? What's so good about any of this? David, we don't have long to talk. Just know that you being down here has given us a unique opportunity. You want your wife back? He asked. I do, I replied. And then listen to me. Listen carefully. There are more souls that have been wrongfully stolen from Heaven's grasp. I need you to get them back for us. I narrowed my eyes at him. Why me? That's a conversation for later. You're not the only one to start a rebellion down here. During Rasputin's next fight, there's going to be an attack. But it's actually a rescue mission. The real rebellion wants you, David. It wants you badly. Gabe snapped his fingers and disappeared, leaving me alone with Azazel, who unbuttoned her dress and started to mess with her silver hair. Gotta keep up appearances, human, she said, before walking towards the doorway. Rasputin's next fight was against the champion of Gehenna's gladiatorial pit. I learned that because the champion would be present, so would most of the princes and princesses of Hell. Also, I wasn't to speak of said plan with anyone. Not even Dwayne and the others from a previous level. Azazel had kept a tight lid on things. She knew there was a civil war brewing in this dimension. What she didn't know was where everyone else's loyalties were at. The plan was simple. When the fight came, I'd lay low in the staging area. There would be an attack from the actual rebel forces up top on the royal family, while a small squad would be sent into the staging area to smuggle me and a host of other battle slaves out. The plan was simple, yet complicated at the same time. I did find myself wondering why I'd been chosen. All these souls were about to sacrifice themselves to break me and a few others out. I didn't understand. Around an hour before the fight was supposed to take place, I found myself standing with Rasputin and Dwayne in the staging area. We'd been watching another fight, one in which a demonic-looking Genghis Khan had just finished shoving a flaming spear through the bowels of a man they called Lancelot. I shuddered. Rasputin put his hand on my shoulder and chuckled. "It happens to all of us eventually," he said. "I know, still crows though. We are in hell, my friend. Everything here is despicable." That was when the horn blared. The horn that signified Abaddon's entourage. The gates to the pit opened, and 2 by 2, they marched in, all while Carlos Estevez gave a speech about their precious king. Abaddon's guards marched in first, led by a knight in black armor that mounted a red lizard with inky black eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, followed by what looked like a host of undead Roman soldiers. "What the hell?" I asked. "Abaddon's royal guard, a bunch of revenants loyal only to him," Gabe said as he seemingly materialized out of nowhere. "They look like centurions," I said. They were. Soldiers in the 9th Roman Legion. He killed most of them. Now they're soulless walking corpses, powered by his magic. After the soldiers marched in, they were followed by a black chariot, helmed by Abaddon himself. Except, he looked different than he had before. What I'd seen was only his earthly form. Now he looked much more Gehennian, sprouting blood red scaly skin, glowing red eyes, 2 massive dragon-like wings, and a mouth full of wolf-like teeth. He wore black armor and a silver crown. He waved at the audience, which went ballistic at his entrance. But my eyes weren't fixated on him. They were fixated on the woman riding in the chariot next to him. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as the rage began to swell inside of me. She stood there, her face worn and her body timid. Her expression seemed sad as she straightened her velvet dress. Her eyes scanned the collar around her neck. She was a slave, just like the rest of us. Only she was being used as Abaddon's plaything. "David, don't do anything stupid," Gabriel said. "I can't leave her here," I replied. "You will have your chance to save her, but you must be patient." I watched as Abaddon came to a stop just ahead of Azazel's suite. "Princess Azazel," he said with a smile. Azazel bowed slightly. "My king." "I have a request to make. A warm-up match, if you will," he said. "What's that?" she asked. "You have in your possession A certain individual, one who interests me. Shamefully, I missed his first bout, but I hear he's very quickly improving. Oh shit, I could hear Rasputin say. I would like to bear witness to the leader of the Helion rebellion before our champions take the pit. I could see Azazel do her best to hide her annoyance at this. Her eyes shot to me. My eyes drifted to a shocked Dwayne. And who would you like to see him fight? Whomever you deem fit. Azazel twirled her silver hair as she thought for a moment. Who would be a good fit? She wondered out loud as she looked at Esteves. Carlo shrugged. What about Santa Anna? He asked. No. He lost to a bunch of rednecks with their daddy's guns. Hannibal? Still healing from his fight with Caesar. Azazel's eyes lit up. I have one. What about rebel versus rebel? She asked. Spartacus? Asked Carlos. Azazel shrugged. It would be a good battle. No, Abaddon said with a laugh. You said whoever I deem fit, my lord. Abaddon groaned under his breath. I was hoping that you'd recommend a certain member of royalty. After all, I do have his wife, Abaddon said as he turned and stared right at me. My denizen's body's blood ran cold. The crowd went berserk at the implication. My lord, he doesn't have the means to cause you any harm, said Azazel. Abaddon shrugged. How about this? I'll use my hands. He can use a sword from our armory. Or even better, one of these, he said as he pulled one of the swords from a centurion's hip. A sword forged in heaven for the 9th. I could see Azazel lean back in her seat. She knew she couldn't really argue. I knew I was about to get utterly annihilated. But to be honest, part of me didn't care. It was a shot at the big man, an opportunity to get my wife back. Can I beat him? I asked as I turned to where Gabe was standing. Only Gabriel had vanished. I looked at Rasputin, who had a sad look in his eyes. He put his hand back on my shoulder. Well, this is unfortunate, he said as the gate opened behind me. My eyes met Dwayne, who only nodded at me. I walked out onto the black sand. It was a good thing I'd already armored up for the break-in. I was armed with the same M4 and pistol, but I knew both those weapons would serve me poorly. Abaddon's guards cleared out as I walked in. He was taller than he had been when we first met. I was only around half his height. He smiled down at me before he glanced up at his chariot, where Anna stood, her eyes devoid of emotion. My heart ached as I got closer to her. She looked so empty, like a broken doll. The sight only made me angry. I wasn't scared, even as Abaddon tossed the gladius at my feet. Hello, Mr. Stone, Abaddon greeted me. I bent down and picked the sword up, my eyes not leaving my wife. Abaddon's eyes went to her, and then me. Ah, that. I thought Azazel broke you. It's whatever though. Tell you what, you get past me, and I'll give her to you. You can take her right here on the Colosseum floor. He smiled sadistically. As I have, so many times. I growled as I charged him, the sword raised high. I tried thrusting it into his stomach, but he was suddenly behind me, his hand clasping the back of my neck as he picked me up and slammed me into the black sand before tossing me aside. My ears rang and my head ached. Still, I shot to my feet. What's the matter, David? Having trouble? I could feel my rage feeding my strength. I charged in again, this time faster. I slashed and stabbed, but Abaddon was just too fast. He was ungodly fast. I couldn't land a single blow. The next thing I knew, I took a right hook to the jaw. I could feel it dislocate. I could feel my teeth come loose. My face hit the sand again. Yet, I still stood. I got to my feet as quickly as I could. Abaddon stood over me, a sadistic smile on his face. "Kneel to me. Submit yourself, and be mine for eternity," he said. "I can give you armies. I can make you a general. All the wonders of Gehenna can be yours. All you have to do is submit." I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it. I looked at him for a second. Then my eyes drifted to my wife. Abaddon noticed this and smiled. "Submit, and I'll give her back to you," he whispered as he knelt to get eye level with me. Part of me wanted to. I wanted her back so bad. I could feel my jaw start to heal itself, but I still couldn't speak. "All you have to do is kneel," he whispered. I thought of the pain my wife had gone through. My eyes met hers again, her face bleeding. I could feel my knees going heavy. I was just about to kneel. That was until Anna shook her head no as she mouthed one word to me. "Grace. Our daughter. Our little girl. My whole world after Anna was murdered. Abaddon had hurt her. He'd bled her. I didn't know what happened to her, but I knew she wasn't dead. I also knew that if I knelt to this thing, I'd have failed every standard I'd ever taught her. I felt my rage building again. The grip on my sword tightened as I thrusted it with everything I had. Abaddon effortlessly caught the sword by the blade, his brow raised and eyes more amused than anything. "Shame on you, David," he said as he shoved his fist through my chest. I stared at him for a second as my eyes shut down to the massive hole in my chest. I fell to the floor, my eyes still looking up at his smile. Abaddon raised his foot to stomp onto my head. I closed my eyes. But the impact never came. I heard a loud thunk. Then the shrill gasps of the audience. My eyes shut open. Rasputin stood over me. Dwayne pulled me to my feet. "Let's go!" he shouted. I struggled to speak or even think. I watched as Rasputin launched a volley of hellfire at Abaddon. I wondered why Abaddon didn't walk through it, but then I noticed the other figure in the flames with him. This one with two white wings and a sword glowing white. My eyes then shifted to Anna, who had been thrown to the Colosseum floor. "Anna!" I groaned. She was surrounded by 3 undead centurions. She struggled to her feet, one of the undead soldiers grabbing her arm and yanking her forward. But they were suddenly cut off by another centurion. Only this one's sword was glowing a neon blue color. He easily cut through all 3 like they were made of papier-mâché. He helped my wife back to her feet as he led her towards us. I was still heavily injured to the point where Dwayne had to practically drag me to the extraction point. This was around the point where everything went black. When I awoke, I found myself laying underneath a red-tinted sky, surrounded on all sides by black mountains. I groaned softly as I sat up and examined my chest. The hole had healed up, but it still hurt like hell. Dwayne sat next to me. "You're awake," he greeted. I looked around. We were at some kind of camp, one that was constructed by crude-looking torn tents. There were more denizens running around as well. They all had weapons of some sort, be it guns, swords, axes. I could see Alice and Terry sitting by a fire. I could also see Gabe speaking with the centurion that had rescued my wife. That was when I realized it. My wife was here. I sat up quickly. "Anna?" I shouted. "Easy," Dwayne said. "She went to go get you more of the ooze." "Ooze?" I asked. "Slime from the flesh pit," Gabriel said as he approached us. The angel's wings had been hidden away. He reached out a hand to help pull me up, and I took it, noticing a massive gash on his forearm. "Couldn't kill him, but we did what we had to do," Gabriel said, as if reading my thoughts again. My eyes met the centurion's. "Who are you?" I asked. "You can call me Maxis, formerly Primus Pilus of the 9th Roman Legion, now leader of the Resistance." "The one they called Lord Maxis?" I asked. The man shrugged as he stroked his beard. "I hate that name." I looked him up and down. That was when I realized something. The scar across the man's cheek. Our denizen bodies heal, leaving no scars or marks whatsoever. This man wasn't in a denizen body. He was alive. Alive and in hell. He seemed to notice what I was thinking. "It's a long story," he said with a grin. That was when I heard her voice again. The voice that made me stop dead in my tracks. "David?" she said with a quivering voice. I turned to see Anna standing there, a bucket of slime in her hand. I started to step towards her, but she visibly flinched. I stopped and put my hands up. "Anna," I said with a choked up voice as I tried to hold back tears of my own. She dropped the bucket and ran to me, throwing her arms around me and hugging me tightly, sobbing as she did so. I was sobbing myself, holding her in my arms. Both of us had dropped to the ground. "We don't have long," I could hear Maxis whisper to Gabriel. "It's okay, Maxis. With what she's been through, give her all the time she needs."
Of all the places in the cosmos, there is none more vile than Gehenna. None more obscene. None more dreaded. What would you say if I told you that Gehenna was a necessary evil? That all those damned souls suffering had a purpose? That all that pain and torture was for a greater good that was so incomprehensibly important to the balance of the cosmos that if the realm were to fall apart, it would mean the end of existence? You'd think that I was crazy, right? Those first few days with the Resistance were hard. Anna cried a lot. Maxis and Gabriel discussed battle plans. From what I could make out, the battles fought so far were akin to that of a guerrilla war. It reminded me of the Shadow Wars. Harass, break off, harass some more. These were jabs directed at a larger goal. You see, Gabriel had come to Gehenna with a mission. That mission was to free souls that didn't belong here, which he claimed there were thousands of. I questioned this, of course. How could heaven let innocent souls go to hell? He looked at me with a sad expression. The souls in question were down here when they perished. Heaven couldn't recover them. Not yet, he said. What about God? Yahweh could. Heaven couldn't, he said. I had no clue what he meant by that. I wanted to ask more, but we were interrupted by the arrival of a scout bringing a report on Abaddon's troop movements. We'd set up camp in the Gehennian mountains near a naturally occurring flesh pit. The place was in the Gehennian outskirts, outside of the 9 levels in a similar way as the river Styx. I could actually see the river Styx if I climbed high enough. It was a black ocean under a red-tinted sky. There were no waves. The water looked like flat marble, and it stretched on for miles and miles. Maxis stood next to me on the mountainside as we observed it. A cold chill passed over me, causing my denizen body to shiver. I could hear Maxis exhale. The water's surprisingly warm, but it's also filled with Leviathan spawn, he said. You've been inside it? I asked. Maxis chuckled. Yeah, not by choice. It's where I landed after Abaddon tossed me into the clouds. How did you not drown? I asked. A Leviathan spawn tried to eat me. I killed it with my sword and floated on its body until a pirate ship found me. I raised a brow. There are pirates in hell? Where else would thieves go? He asked. I chuckled at this. They weren't pirates. They were loyalists to Lucifer that were fleeing the new regime. They wanted to eat me, all aside from their leader, some demon whore called Azos. I ended up being her sex puppet for a few years, while they went from island to island, each with its own arsenal of horrors, trying to avoid Abaddon's navy. He caught up to us eventually though. Azos and her troops were crucified. I only escaped because the general that caught us happened to be Azazel, who's been Gabriel's eyes down here since the coup. Good for her, I said. Azazel had made me miserable over the last few days. I wasn't ready to give her any credit just yet. I think Maxis knew this, which was why he changed the subject. You wonder why you were saved? He asked. Saxon said I wasn't supposed to be down here. I replied. Many aren't. Abaddon has become proficient at stealing souls. We've saved as many innocents as we can, but we need more manpower. You're a soldier, a good one according to Gabriel. I'm sure there are plenty of those down here, I said. Not many who were taken by Abaddon personally, which is why we need you. Maxis took a deep breath. I lost almost every single one of my brothers down here, souls and all. At the Battle of the River Styx, Abaddon gave us a choice. Submit or die. We chose, and now their souls belong to him. Most are locked in denizen bodies on the 9th level, but there are those who survived by fighting, those who Abaddon kept alive to torture, those whose minds he broke until they submitted to him and only him. He calls them the Ghost Legion. What does any of this have to do with me? I asked. Only a soul meant for heaven can free them. So says Gabriel, he said. And you wanted one that can fight, I said. I wanted one that wouldn't break. Abaddon chose you himself, which means you must have done something to upset him when you were living. A few days passed. More planning. We never stayed in the same area of the mountains. We made erratic movements, staying in caves when we could to avoid the sight of the giant locusts that would pass overhead every once in a while. I'm not sure how much time we spent getting ready. I know as time passed, my wife cried less and my hair and beard began to grow. I must admit that I was a little annoyed that it was speckled with flakes of grey instead of being completely black like they had been on Earth in my youth. A perfect copy of your earthly body, only with an ability to regenerate to deadly wounds. I was called to Gabriel's tent one evening. Was it evening? The sky in this place never changed. Eventually, there came a day when Maxis called me forward. Gabriel was set to have a meeting with another informant, and he wanted us in attendance. This meeting took place on level 6 in a small pyramid-like temple. The meeting was set up by Azazel with another of the princes, this one known as Ramiel. Our briefing on him was short. He was one of the angels that fell from heaven during Lucifer's rebellion. Supposedly, he wasn't very supportive of Abaddon's coup. Gabriel knew this. The problem? Ramiel was, for all intents and purposes, a coward. He didn't make moves unless he knew he could win. We arrived at the temple first, Gabriel teleporting Maxis and I. The temple was cold. Colder than most of the areas I'd been to up to that point. It was made from the same black stone as the other structures. The room we were in seemed like an office. We stood there for around 10 minutes before I could smell sulfur. That was when Ramiel arrived. He appeared in his human form rather than a demonic one. He looked like a regular guy in a suit. Only his eyes were an inky black color. He smiled upon seeing Gabriel. "Hello, brother. Been a while," he greeted with his hands in his pockets. "Ramiel," Gabriel said in a serious tone. "Azazel tells me you've been busy. Hell has too. With the attack on the king and all, you think this place is on fire." Gabriel exhaled. "Abaddon shouldn't have taken innocent souls." Spare me the whole innocent souls. I know why you're down here fighting your proxy war. You want the Nine's souls. My question is, why?" asked Ramiel. Gabriel exhaled again. "That's none of your business, Fallen One. On the contrary, if you gain access to the 9th level, you gain access to the seal. If the seal breaks." "Heaven has no interest in breaking the seal," Gabriel said. Ramiel took a deep breath. "Why should I trust you?" "What interest would Heaven have in breaking the seal, Ramiel? It could mean the end of the entire multiverse. Aside from your precious Earth Prime, or did you forget what the 9th gave their lives for?" "My brothers gave their lives protecting my world from your king," barked Maxis. Ramiel eyed Maxis, then Gabriel. "Why do you want the 9's souls? I can get you into the capital, but I won't until you tell me." Gabriel grunted under his breath. "We received intelligence that Abaddon is using the 9's survivor's blood to create his own Omega Serum, which he's using to resurrect millions of bodies from the Earths he's conquered. Bodies with no souls." I could see Ramiel smile. "Meat fresh for the possessing," he said. "An almost endless army of super soldiers, one that he could invade Earth Prime with. All he needs is a way there," Maxis added. "But why do you need their souls?" asked Ramiel. "Because a war is raging across the multiverse. Not just one here, but everywhere. Wars need soldiers." "Soldiers with no bodies aren't useful," Ramiel said. I could see Gabriel smirk. "Leave that to me." Ramiel would give us intel. He told us that a convoy of slaves were scheduled to be delivered to the capital within the next week, that we could infiltrate it and hitch a ride. Ramiel made that part easy. He was overseeing the convoy. We spent a lot of time prepping for the mission. I'm sure you're wondering, why not just infiltrate the capital through the monolith in Ramiel's throne room? Well, we actually had someone working that angle already. The rebellion had garnered quite the arsenal of weapons over their millennia of war against the Gahinian Empire. I'd gotten a black breastplate and 2 black short swords. I was a highly trained CIA agent in my prime when I was alive. I was an expert with modern weapons, not swords. Don't get me wrong, I could hold my own against vampires, but that usually took a lot of prep. The fighting in Gehenna was different. They had guns, yes, but bullets weren't fatal because they weren't made from that black metal. Maxis would spar with me during our week of prep. These sparring sessions almost never went my way. Maxis was fast. He was fast, and he had thousands of years of experience. It was frustrating, but all in all, necessary. I also tried to get back lost time with Anna. As stated previously, she wasn't the same as I'd remembered. It took her some time to adjust to not being tortured. She asked about Grace a lot. What was she like? I answered honestly. It brought me back to the night that I'd lost my life. I could remember facing off with Jackson. He'd stabbed me through the chest, all the while talking about how my daughter was an abomination. I wasn't sure if he believed it or not. I know Anna's sister did. Moria was many things. Forgiving wasn't one of them. She tried to have Grace killed the day she was born, but Anna and I stopped it. All it cost us was Anna's life. I remembered my last words to Jackson. She's not an abomination. She's fucking perfect. The look on Jackson's face when I detonated the explosives hidden in the room was priceless. It's too bad that they didn't kill him. But as it turns out, Grace did. The day came where we joined Ramiel's convoy. We met Ramiel and several of his slaves next to a river. There were 70 of us in the war party. Gabriel wasn't included. He was with the main force, which would set up outside the city of These and launch an attack once the gate was open. According to Ramiel, these would be lightly guarded as Abaddon and his host were at a monolith to Earth 2131, which Gabriel described as Abaddon's forward operating base into the multiverse. Ramiel gave us all black helmets to hide our identities. They were crude and almost Spartan-like in design. They were also uncomfortable. Ramiel raised a brow at me as I stuffed my head into one. "You like it?" he asked. "No." Ramiel smirked. "Good. It's only there to protect your brain." Half of us were disguised as Ramiel's personal slave guard. We stuffed the other half of our troops into torture boxes that were stacked in rows of 5, Dwayne being one of them. Maxis and I set up in battle lines next to them. My hands gripped my swords tightly as Ramiel and Gabriel looked over us. Gabriel took a deep breath. "Take the gate quickly. The moment the violence starts, Abaddon will know." "For the 9th, Maxis replied softly. I looked at Maxis, who shrugged at me. Ramiel laughed as he snapped his fingers. I was suddenly at that massive gate again, the dragon head staring down at me with unadulterated hate. I could see the rat-caped figures above looking down at us whilst gripping their spears. Ramiel banged on the door. "I've got a slave delivery." The doors opened slowly. Ramiel was confronted by a tall, white-skinned demon with silver hair and sharp teeth. "Prince Ramiel," it greeted in a deep voice as it bowed. "Hello, Talos," Ramiel replied as he motioned us inside. My heart somehow started to beat even harder when we made it through the gate. We were surrounded by 10 to 12 demonic soldiers, all of whom weren't really paying us any mind. My eyes locked on a particular pair that was talking whilst leaning against a nearby building. The building had a stairwell that led up to the top of the wall, which was our objective. My grip tightened on one of the swords at my hip as I split off from the column and walked straight up to the demons. They were both maybe 7 feet tall. Maxis was a step behind me. One of the demons smirked at me as we approached. "Look, Angus, the vermin approach," it said. They weren't expecting me to lunge forward and shove my blade into the closest one's neck. Maxis did the same with the other. The demon smiled at me as he died. Its breath was rancid, like rotten flesh. I could hear the shouting coming from all around us as the torture boxes popped open and our men began to move. The demons were all caught by surprise. I could see Ramiel standing over a body covered in blood. He turned to me with a savage grin across his face. "Get to your positions," he shouted. Maxis and I entered the building. It was dark, and it took a moment for our eyes to adjust. But when they did, I was glad to have had my sword up, as standing at the base of the stairway was what looked like a Roman centurion. Only, this one wasn't zombified like the others. This one was very much among the living. I could see Maxis hesitate for a moment. "Crassus?" Maxis greeted. "You are in violation of Gehenian law. Surrender now or face judgment," the centurion said as its sword ignited a purple color. Maxis ignited his own blue blade. "We don't have to do this. You can stand with me. We can save our brothers," Maxis said softly. "My loyalty belongs to my king," it said. Maxis sighed before lunging forward with his sword. This Crassus was talented, but Maxis was adept at fighting the corrupted, dodging his first swing with a quick sidestep before sinking his gladius into the soldier's armpit. The centurion crumpled to the floor. We made our way up the stairs and onto the wall. We could see out in the distance where Gabriel had arrived with our forces. We encountered a few more undead Roman soldiers that we made short work of before making it to the door control mechanism. Maxis waved his ignited sword. Gabriel and our rebellion began their march. It was then that I heard the commotion from below us. I turned to face back inside the wall, where I found what looked like a contingent of Gahenian soldiers marching down the obsidian streets in formation toward the gate. "The city watch is early," I said to Maxis as I turned and started for the stairs. Maxis laughed as he stepped off the edge of the wall. I could hear him giving commands as I made my way down the stairwell. When I reached the ground, the demons were upon our forces with their pikes. There was a massive bloody melee going on. I was very quickly set upon by a demon that was easily twice my height. It brought its pike down hard on me, but I dived to one side. This thing had a major reach on me, and I was armed with swords. It thrust its pike towards my midsection, and I stepped to the side and grabbed the pike under its head. I was yanked forward hard, the demon catching me by my throat with its cold, greasy hand. I could see it smile with shark-like teeth under its helmet as it choked the air out of me. A blue blade flashed in front of me. The demon hissed as it fumbled backward, its now severed hand still attached to my neck. I fell to the ground, looking up just in time to see Maxis separate the thing's head from its shoulders. I got to my feet just as Gabriel and our entire rebellion came charging through the door. Step 1 was complete. We'd taken the gate. Now it was time for step 2. It was time to get to the Capitol building. We practically rioted through the streets of these, killing any and all demons we came across with extreme prejudice. We lost men. Men I was sure would regenerate in the flesh pits and be sent off to be tortured. We eventually reached the Capitol building. The miles-high pyramid could be seen from anywhere in the city. When we arrived, we found it guarded by more undead Roman soldiers, which were led by a mangy-looking demon. They stood between us and the massive triangular pyramid entrance. The demon stood on a balcony above them. "Maxis, Gabriel, King Abaddon is aware of your presence. Surrender now, and he won't kill either of you." "Fuck you, Legion," Ramiel barked from next to me. I think I visibly flinched. I didn't realize he was next to me. Legion flashed us a bloody smile. "Ramiel, your treachery has been noted." "It's not my treachery you should worry about," Ramiel barked as a blade suddenly exploded from Legion's chest. Azazel lifted Legion up off of the balcony with a double-sided sword and then tossed him off. The Roman legionnaires readied themselves for battle. Gabriel stepped ahead of them all and snapped his fingers. Floating above his hand was a glowing red stone that was slightly larger than a football. I tilted my head to one side. The 9th Roman Legion charged in, but the stone shone even brighter. There was a sudden flash, and the entire legion was just gone. "Was that all of them?" asked Maxis. "No," Gabriel said as he looked up at Azazel, who nodded down at us. She'd led her forces into the Capitol building through the monoliths. Her forces, which consisted of a few loyal demon princes and a ton of battle slaves. They took the Capitol building pretty easily. "How many?" asked Maxis. "Less than half, but rest assured, my friend, Abaddon will come with the rest." We held the capital of Hell, for now. We knew we couldn't for very long. Gabriel took me to the throne room. It was larger than the banquet hall, with a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with brightly lit torches. Gabriel and I stood at the monolith that led to the 9th level. The monolith was different from the others. It was larger, being maybe 3 times my height. It also didn't have the runes on it. Instead, the black stone had a pentagram carved into it. Gabriel walked closer and placed his hand on it. "We're close," he said. Everything so far had gone according to plan. The only issue now was going to the 9th level and facing whatever beast Abaddon had waiting for us down there. Maxis, Gabriel, Dwayne, Anna, Rasputin and I would go inside, while Azazel and Ramiel led the defense of the capital. We'd garnered a sizable army. Between Ramiel and Azazel's forces, our might numbered in the millions. But we would still be outnumbered by the Gahenian military when they arrived. Gabriel activated the monolith. The pentagram started to glow red. Gabriel pulled his sword, and it started to glow white. It was also the first time I felt anything warm since I'd been down here. I eyed my wife. She exhaled as she readied a spear. The 9th level was different. It was colder than the rest of Gehenna. It also seemed to be underground, deep underground. The first thing I noticed was that the place was illuminated by a massive red crystal that was wedged high on the cavern ceiling. Speaking of, the ceiling was tall enough for one to fit a skyscraper inside of. The ground was covered in black sand that seemed to have a thin layer of ice on it. I could see my exhales. We'd exited in a large opening. "Where is this place?" I asked. "This is the end of the multiverse, the closest plain physical reality gets to the outside," Gabriel said as he started to walk forward. "This way." We walked for a few minutes before Gabriel came to a stop. There was a large rock formation ahead of us, a large rock formation that suddenly moved when we stopped. I wasn't sure what to expect when told about a beast, but I honestly wasn't surprised when the kaiju-sized 3-headed dog got to its feet. All 6 of its glowing red eyes locking onto us. The ground rumbled with each step it took. "Cerberus," Maxis grunted. "That is big dog," Rasputin said. The 3-headed beast snarled. Gabriel groaned with annoyance before blitzing forward. He moved in a blur. For such a dangerous beast, the Cerberus was no match for the raw power and speed of an archangel. Cerberus was cut down in minutes. The beast fell to the ground, and Gabriel touched down ahead of us. He put his sword back in its scabbard. We all stood there in dumbstruck silence for a good few seconds before Maxis's voice spoke up. "Save some for the rest of us." Gabriel laughed softly, then motioned for us to continue. After a few more minutes of walking, we came to a wall that seemed to be made of glowing red energy. A small stone table in the center with a human-shaped handprint in the center. I could see past the energy wall, where there were stacks of torture boxes. Torture boxes that were connected to more of those pipes that I'd seen in the black halls earlier. Actually, I could see the pipes on the ceiling of this cavern. I could see in the distance that the pipes were connected to some kind of cube, and then beyond that, there was another wall of red energy. Gabriel turned to me. "Only 2 kinds of beings can open this: Gehennan royalty, or a soul meant for heaven, stolen by hell. This is where we need you. You press this button, it will lower the barrier. It will also send a signal straight to heaven, the signal they've been waiting for," he said. I approached the table and placed my hand on the human print. The power that suddenly flew through me made every bone in my denizen body ache. I could see flashes of Jackson, Anna, Moria, Shaw, and even my daughter Grace. I could see the vampires I tortured in the Shadow Wars. I could see the monsters I'd killed. I could see my father. I could see his father. I found myself standing in a fog. Then came the voice, deep and ethereal.
Are you innocent?
"No, I'm not," I said. "I did horrible things in life. I tortured. I murdered. I abandoned my friends for a woman."
Then why do you seek salvation?
"Why does anyone seek salvation from this place?" I asked. The deep voice chuckled. That was when a hand clasped my shoulder. I was jolted back to the present, where I found my hand hadn't even touched the table yet. I could see Gabriel. Then I could hear Gabriel. "Stone?" I looked at him and then pressed my hand down on the button. The wall fell immediately. We walked up to the stacks of boxes. The men standing inside them all stared down at us. Most eyes seemed vacant. Some looked sad. Some looked surprised. Not a single one made a sound. I could hear Maxis's breath hitch in his throat. My brothers, he whispered. Gabriel snapped his fingers, and the boxes all opened. Most of the men hesitated. Why aren't they moving? Anna asked. They've been down here for over 1,000 years, tortured every day, all to feed that thing, Gabriel said, gesturing to the black cube. Maxis, they need to come willingly, Gabriel said. Brothers, I know how you've suffered. I come to you with an offer, an opportunity. I can grant you vengeance. Vengeance for your deaths. Vengeance for your suffering. Vengeance for the 9th. It was quiet for another moment. Then, the first man stepped from his cell. Then another. Then another. For the 9th, one shouted. For the 9th. All of the men screamed in unison. Maxis organized the men into formation, and we began our march back to the monolith, where the plan was to hold the city until Heaven's forces showed up, which shouldn't take long. There was a sense of relief when we began heading back. The plan had gone almost without a hitch. That is, until we exited the monolith. Abaddon stood there next to Victor, Azazel, and Ramiel on their knees behind him. The rest of Abaddon's undead legion surrounding them, along with an entire host of demons. Abaddon held his hand out wide when we walked out. Gabriel, the balls on you. You started a whole ass civil war in hell, Abaddon said with a smile. How did? Gabriel started. How what? We came in the same way Azazel did. Speaking of, how did you turn her and Ramiel? It's a shame, I'm going to crucify them. Abaddon looked around, his eyes locked on me. I see, you have freed the 9th. He took a deep breath. Tell me, did the seal fall? No, Gabriel said. Well, at least you're not stupid. I'm going to need those souls back though. I could feel my body tense up. I could see Anna tighten her grip on her spear and get into a battle stance. The men behind us readied themselves as well. Although they were all unarmed and naked, they weren't going back without a fight. My eyes scanned the undead Romans ahead of us. I could see Abaddon give a signal. Gabriel didn't seem fazed when they started walking towards us. He snapped his fingers again. The red stone reappeared. It hovered over his hand. I could see Abaddon suddenly signal his forces to stop. Now, how in the fuck did you get Cain to give you the Philosopher's Stone? Asked Abaddon. Gabriel smirked. This was his idea. The stone suddenly began to glow brightly. Abaddon screamed as he charged Gabriel. There was a bright, blinding flash that accompanied a massive surge of energy. I was knocked off of my feet. My hands instinctively searched for Anna as my vision began to come back. I got to my feet at the same time as everyone else. Abaddon was on a knee, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand. I looked to my left, where a demon was charging me, this one 7 to 8 feet tall. Shit, I barked. But the demon was intercepted by a Roman soldier, one who shoved his blade into the demon's neck. I exhaled as I thought Maxis had come to my rescue yet again. But then, a hand grabbed me and pulled me to my feet. I was half expecting it to be Gabriel. But imagine my shock when I was looking into the face of Maxis. Then I'd noticed it. There were Roman soldiers all around us. What's going on? I gasped. We needed their souls and bodies in one place, Maxis said as he turned around. There were Roman soldiers battling demons, living Roman soldiers in old, battered armor. For the 9th! The soldiers echoed as they fought. Jupiter's cock. I missed that, Maxis said. I cast my eyes around the throne room. Gabriel and Victor had engaged each other in a sword battle. Azazel and Ramiel were freed by Rasputin. My eyes locked on Abaddon, who had gotten a hold of Anna by her throat. His eyes locked onto me. He smiled widely before he turned and tossed her back through the monolith, then vanished.
No!
I growled. I didn't wait for any help. I ran through the monolith, leaving Maxis and his men fighting the hordes of hell. Gabriel yanked his sword from Victor's insides. I ran hard all the way back to the glowing red wall, the one behind the cube, where I found my wife passed out at Abaddon's feet. His hands collapsed behind his back.
Let her go.
I roared. Abaddon scoffed. He looked out into the void beyond the seal. Beyond the red glow was nothing but darkness, infinite darkness. That was when I noticed that the obsidian cube had a barrel of swords that fired the red energy that formed the seal. I stood there watching it for a moment. All that suffering, this is what it's for, Abaddon said as he turned to me. Let her go. Abaddon giggled. You humans are so funny. I could see movement in the void behind him. It made my heart flutter. A massive tendril suddenly struck the shield. The ground around me shook violently. Abaddon put his hand on the shield. Amonu knows the seal is weakened. That was when I heard that deep, ethereal voice again.
Destroy the cube. Salvation can be yours. Freedom can be yours.
Abaddon turned back to me. You hear him, don't you? Abaddon started to step toward me. Did you really think that the suffering of the wayward was without purpose? Do you think it needless? You set them free. You made the barrier weak. Now, you've got to make it right. Fuck you, I growled. Abaddon took a deep breath and snapped his fingers. The next thing I knew, I was standing behind Abaddon on a rooftop. The air outside was cold. I coughed a few times as I got to my feet and pulled my swords. Where are we? Earth 2555, Abaddon said as he looked up at the moon. My eyes followed his gaze. The moon itself had been cracked apart. It looked like as if it was in 3 pieces. That wasn't it though. The cityscape was covered in ruined skyscrapers, and all the streets were flooded. A loud roar rang out. I could see a massive crab-like creature covered in blotches of black tendrils bounding from one building to another. It had noticed our presence and was on its way. What happened? I asked. Amonu, this is what happens when he gets into a universe unchecked. I looked into the sky again. That was when I realized that there were no stars in the sky, only the debris left by the moon. Abaddon turned to me and smiled. Nothing suffers like souls meant for heaven. The levels of energy they produce are ravenously powerful. Do you know how much power the ninth gave us? The crab creature was even closer now. I didn't reply to Abaddon. I just glared at him. You freed over 5,000 souls. Now, you're going to be the replacement. You and that little whore wife of yours. Then your friends, everyone you know and love. And then, I'll be going back to Earth Prime for your daughter. I roared as I went to thrust my sword at him. Abaddon stepped to one side and slapped me across the face. I fell to the ground. I could see the crab creature standing behind him now, its tendrils coming for him. Abaddon snapped his fingers again. We were back in D's, only we were in the streets. I slowly got to my feet and examined my surroundings. I could see the battle was still raging. Demons fought slaves everywhere. Hordes of semi-truck-sized locusts infected the skies. The fighting was bloody and brutal. I looked up at Abaddon, who stood over me. He now held my wife by the back of her neck. He looked down at me with a sinister smile. We can do this the easy way, or... Then came the trumpet, the loudest trumpet I'd ever heard in my entire existence. I could see the sky past Abaddon. The giant locusts overhead were suddenly blown apart by blasts of blue energy as silver-colored flying saucers filled the sky. Then came a bright flash of light. Abaddon was suddenly not standing over me anymore. Gabriel stood there facing away from me. "Get your wife and get out of here. It's time to evacuate." I sat up, my wife a crumpled heap on the ground. I scooped her up and shook her awake. Anna looked at me, her eyes dreary, and her face was full of uncertainty. "What happened?" she asked. I didn't answer as we got to our feet. I heard a ravenous cry from behind me as Abaddon caught Gabriel's short arm and flung him into a building. "Stone!" a voice called out. I turned to see Dwayne running up to me. "Let's go, your ride is waiting," Dwayne shouted. We began to move. We may have made it 2 blocks through the war zone. There were slaves being yanked off the ground by massive locusts. The Black Knight from the Colosseum watching on as his lizard eviscerated some poor soul. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What brought me to a stop was the voice. "David Stone," Saxon called out from behind us. I turned around to see the pale-skinned reptilian-like features staring at me. He had a sword in his hand. "I knew I'd find you here," he hissed. "Where's Jackson?" I asked as I readied my own blade. "Jackson Helsing is currently indisposed. Don't worry yourself. You've got far more pressing concerns at the moment." Anna started to step forward with her spear, but I held my sword out ahead of her. I had a bone to pick with this particular demon, the one who relished in my torment. I'd ended him once, I would do it again. I charged Saxon. The demon master blocked my initial blows with his own sword before countering. Saxon was a good swordsman, but he wasn't half the swordsman Maxis was. His counters were ill-timed. I blocked the first and parried the second before kicking Saxon in the chest. Saxon stumbled back a few steps and roared at me. He charged forward, only to be suddenly hit in the chest by a spear. I turned back to Anna, who eyed me. "We don't have time for this," she said. Saxon dropped to his knees. I groaned as I took 2 steps toward him. "I'll come back for you," the demon grunted. "And I'll kill you again," I sneered as I raised my sword and lopped his head from his shoulders. We kept moving, eventually coming across Azazel and Rasputin. Azazel had what looked like a demon prince pinned to the ground with her blade. She pulled it out, and blood flew everywhere. Rasputin turned to us. "This way." Azazel led us through the chaos. We had to fight demons and stray blaster fire from the ships overhead around every corner. We did this for maybe 10 minutes before we came across a massive figure, one that caused all of us to slide to a stop. The figure wore dark obsidian armor and wore a helmet adorned with 2 ram horns. Its skin was crimson and its eyes were black as night. He was 3 times my height. The demon had a massive battle axe. It roared at us as it stomped forward. "What the hell is that?" I asked. "Nergal," Rasputin chuckled as he stepped in front of us and raised his arms. 2 massive chunks of obsidian were ripped from the road and flung towards the beast. Nergal sliced one in half with his axe before using his shoulder to shatter the other. Rasputin sent a tornado of fire his way, but he barreled through that as well. I gritted my teeth. Hell's champion was upon Rasputin, bringing his axe down on Rasputin's head. Azazel morphed into her more snake-like form. Nergal may have been the champion of Hell. Azazel was a princess and one of the fallen ones. She caught the axe with her double-bladed sword. Rasputin suddenly raised his hands, and a wall of fire shot up into Nergal's face. The demon lumbered back a few steps. Azazel moved fast, whirling around with her sword before shoving it into his throat. Blood splattered everywhere as the demon fell. We kept moving through the streets, through the cacophony of violence and destruction. If war on Earth was hell, then what was war in hell? Eventually, we made it back to the gate, where I found one of those flying saucers had landed. There was a walkway that led up from the ground straight into it. At the base of the walkway stood a man in a familiar-looking suit. It was covered in metallic plating over a black bodysuit. His eyes were glowing a neon blue. Only this wasn't Nemesis. This one had a red Roman-style plum across its head and a scarlet cape on his back. He was flanked on either side by several men in clunky-looking suits of armor, all of which were firing blue plasma bolts. "David Stone?" the man in the suit asked. "Yes," I replied. "Let's get out of here," he replied. We did as bid. Well, Anna, Dwayne, and I did. Rasputin and Azazel stayed behind. Azazel saying, "Someone has to stay behind to fight this civil war." I wish I could say I gave them more fanfare as we left, but there wasn't much time. We boarded the ship in a hurry, and the armored men followed us up the walkway. The inside of the ship was bigger than I expected. There was a man in the cockpit fiddling with the controls. "Royce, get us out of here," the cybernetic soldier ordered. The man pulled up on the controls. I could feel my chest tremble as the ship lifted off the ground. A few moments later, we were teleported away. We were brought back to Earth 0067, where I would learn the man who picked us up was called Marcus. He was also a friend of Max's, and the only member of the 9th Roman Legion that truly escaped the Battle of the River Styx. We spent a few weeks on Earth 0067. We were given a room on a keeper base. It took time to process everything. I'd escaped hell with my wife. We slept a lot. I didn't realize how exhausting everything had been until I found myself in an actual bed. We missed our daughter like crazy. But because we were in denizen bodies, we couldn't go back to Earth Prime without catching on fire. We also tallied the many denizens that had been recovered in the rebellion. We didn't save enough. Most that we did save were mental wrecks that had to be healed. As far as the 9th went, every single member who made it out was outfitted with one of the same suits as Marcus. They would stay on Earth 0067 to train. I would also be introduced to Cain, who had loaned the Philosopher's Stone to Gabriel and planned the whole operation in Hell. He'd created a task force among both Heaven and the Keepers who were fighting a multiversal war against Gehenna, a war that needed soldiers. I also learned about this, Amonu. I learned that, yes, while we had weakened the seal, but not enough for Amonu to come through, there were still trillions of souls being tortured in Hell, their suffering feeding the seal. But with the 9th's souls being meant for Heaven, the seal had been supercharged. It meant that Abaddon would have to spend more time getting things in order rather than invading other Earths. It was still a tough pill to swallow. The fate of the entire multiverse being based, the seal was fed enough suffering. I also learned that an altar used to be in the place of the cube, that it was the site where Abaddon's mother, Lilith, created a tear in space and time during the days of Genesis as she tried to summon her dark god after he had been banished. The seal was put up by Lucifer once Lilith realized how badly she'd messed up. It may have been 5 weeks before Gabriel requested our presence. We were escorted through the base into a large room, which went silent when we entered. Gabriel stood there with another angel, this one slightly taller and with a bit more muscle. They were joined by a man wearing a black suit and tie, and another man in a grey suit, this one standing in front of Marcus and Maxis, who both wore their new cybernetic armor. "Hello, Mr. Stone," Gabriel greeted. I nodded. Gabriel gestured to the other angel. "This is Michael." He motioned to the man in the black suit. "Abel." Then the grey suit. "Quintus, you know Marcus and Maxis," he said. I stood there watching them, more unsure of how to respond than anything. "I'm sure you're wondering why we brought you here," Gabriel started. "We want to discuss what comes next," said Michael. "Yes," agreed Quintus. "What comes next? We're dead," I said in a confused voice. Michael raised his eyebrows as he eyed Gabriel. "It appears so, but what if we could offer you a second chance as a gratitude for your suffering in Hell?" asked Michael. "What kind of second chance?" I asked. Gabriel smirked. The 9th still has training and mental recovery to do. Maxis will be staying here to help with that. The multiverse, however, is still under constant threat. We'd thought our efforts in Hell would slow Abaddon's plans, and they did, but not as much as we'd like. We would grant you a new body, one crafted by the power of heaven. We would have you join our Hell Hunters, added Marcus. An angelic body? Like a light bender? I asked. Abel chuckled. No, this one is much more powerful. It's designed to kill archdemons. Why give it to me? I asked. We're at war. Wars need soldiers, but not just soldiers. Wars need heroes, said Gabriel. I'm not a hero, I replied. I admit, I wasn't sure why my soul had been meant for heaven, and while I didn't consider myself evil, I'd done horrible things in life. Abel smirked. There's a teenage girl on Earth Prime who would beg to differ. I thought of Grace, my daughter, the person I'd given my life to protect, the person who was my entire world before I died. I exhaled slowly. If I do this, can I see her again? I asked. Gabriel and Michael looked at each other. I could see Gabriel smirking. Michael turned his head back toward me with a smile. I wouldn't separate a father from his child. I turned back to Anna, who smiled softly and nodded at me. Then, when do we start?